Hello, if you've been here before, hi, welcome back. If not, hello. My name is David. I make videos talking about media, mostly stories that I like to talk about. This is the last of the set of 3 books that changed me series that I'm doing. I'm still going to continue it, but that's far in the future. This is the last of the 3. Obviously, it's going to be of Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi. I apologize for mispronouncing her name when I have mentioned her prior. But yes, Homegoing is the focus of this long, long video. I actually don't know how long it's going to be, but I don't suspect it's going to be short. The script for this video is more than double the size of the script of The God of Small Things, and they're about the same size of book. So yeah, I have a lot to talk about in this book. This is also the notebook that I have, obviously. Obviously, like always, I'll share the notebook tour, sticker tour at the end of the video. So keep an eye out for that. And yeah, I'm so sorry this is going to be a long one. The set of 3 books, they all mean so much to me, but Homegoing has so much going for it that I could not shorten it. And I also toyed around with making 2 different videos, but I'm just starting out on YouTube, and I'm not gonna threaten that by making 2 videos for I'm not. So it's just gonna be this one long video. So thank you so much for tuning in. Like always, big spoiler alert for the entirety of this book. Please go buy this book, read this book. It's so good. Please Look After Mom, God of Small Things, and Homegoing all as a set, and hopefully people remember me when they read those books. So yes, so thank you very much for coming on this journey with me. This is the synopsis of the book. Ghana, 18th century. 2 half-sisters are born into different villages, each unaware of the other. One will marry an Englishman and lead a life of comfort in the palatial rooms of the Cape Coast castle. The other will be captured in a raid on her village, imprisoned in the very same castle, and sold into slavery. Homegoing follows the parallel paths of these sisters and their descendants through 8 generations, from the Gold Coast to the plantations of Mississippi, from the American Civil War to Jazz Age Harlem. Yaa Gyasi's extraordinary novel illuminates slavery's troubled legacy both for those who were taken and those who stayed, and shows how the memory of captivity has been inscribed on the soul of our nation. If I remember correctly, I got this specific copy. As you can see how beat up it is. I got this specific copy straight from the table at a Barnes & Noble. And, I read it for a long time, it feels like, because of how beat up the state of this book is. Any book that I spent a long time with in high school would end up looking this beat up. I don't know if it illustrates it. This part, this fell off. This fell out. I need to put it back. Books that I spent a long time with would end up looking like this because I would just stuff them into my book bag to and from school and take them out and stuff like that. And it is a sorry state to be in, but it shows how long I loved this book for. This specific copy is the first vintage books edition, April 2017. This was published in 2016, and which means I got the book after 2017, around middle to late 2017. This is the cover that I have. There's other covers that are slightly different, updated covers and stuff like that. For some reason, I have little to no memory of what was happening when I was reading this book. In a way, I remember picking it up from the table, and I remember I know that it was in my backpack because of how messed up it is. I don't remember reading it, but I remember the feeling it gave me. I believe I came across Homegoing from looking at books similar to the book The Thing Around Your Neck by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, which is another amazing book I recommend, mostly set in Nigeria. And you might know Adichie from her famous TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, which I had to watch multiple times throughout high school, and I loved every single watch. I highly recommend The Thing Around Your Neck. And her book, Americana. I didn't connect as much with Americana, but it was also really good. Yes. I, more than likely, read The Thing Around Your Neck prior to Homegoing, which I also don't remember reading the first time, and then used the book as a launch off point to find other books similar to it. Found Homegoing, and then put it on my list to read next. And then I found it, and I bought it, and I read it, and it just blew everything out of the water. Homegoing is 300 pages long exactly, and it follows the family lineage of two half-sisters who grew up in Ghana. Effia is a sister who gets married to a white man, and Esi is a sister who gets sold into slavery. Each subsequent chapter is a quick, short story about their children and their children's children going through history for 7 generations until getting to the modern day Y2K. This book had previously beaten out The God of Small Things for me. I think after diving into each of the 3 books, I can truthfully say that I prefer The God of Small Things, personally, for its technical and emotional prowess. However, Homegoing is elevated because its language is not as complex, which is an issue with God of Small Thing. And because the language is more simple, it's easier to consume than the God of Small Things, while also encompassing a large amount of history, teaching a lot, and also has a really great mastery of character and story. If Yaa Gyasi tried to do everything, all that, but had even more complex language, it'd be a harder book to understand and feel. Sometimes books tend to be a little bit more linguistically complex, such as The God of Small Things, and depending on your reader, but just in general, the complex language does get in the way of the emotional context of the story. And so I'm not saying that Homegoing's writing is super simple. No, it's normal writing that helps deliver the emotion effectively, whereas The God of Small Things has very complex writing with complex emotions in it that doesn't deliver as much heightened emotion and must be dived into more to get that feeling, which is why Homegoing, I would say, is more accessible to the general public, and which is why it gets, to me, it's slightly better than God of Small Things. But personally, intellectually, God of Small Things is also really good. It's a really complex pairing between the two, between the two. So I love God of Small Things. I love Homegoing. I think the fact that the script for Homegoing is much, much longer than The God of Small Things says something as well. So take what you will from that. Yaa Gyasi, she is such an amazing author. She has managed to balance 14 main characters and more than triple the amount of supporting characters that are, siblings, spouses, friendship, enemies. And even then, the 14 main characters are all compelling to varying levels and all feel alive and unique. I think that that's a feat that should be celebrated and elevated. The fact that she was able to create 14 characters, it's just amazing. It's hard enough to write and introduce a compelling character and get the audience invested in them. That's the important part, invested in the character. It's hard enough to do that, especially in such a short period of time. And I cannot fathom the work that she put in to be able to do that 14 times. Granted, yes, he doesn't have to maintain the character throughout a longer story. So, for example, the first character still being there at the end of the chapter, at the end of the story. She doesn't have to do that, which would be an even greater feat, not only introducing 14 characters, but also maintaining interest throughout. She doesn't have to do that. I don't think anyone should do that. I think that would be a messy story. But the fact that each individual chapter, each individual character is highly detailed, present in the story, and interesting to the audience is just amazing. For those reasons and more, I think that Yaa Gyasi's Homegoing is nearly a masterpiece, and everyone should read it. What I will be doing in this video is showing how Gyasi's writing creates compelling characters, how history unfolds before us, and how the plot and story deliver her messages clearly and concisely. I want to show you the immense work Yesi put into this book to appreciate the writing and the story and the characters that she was able to do. Much like the last video, I want to give a content warning. This book does cover heavy themes of racism and violence, as well as brief depictions of sexuality and sexual violence. Unlike the last video with Got Small Things, most of them are not very graphic at all. I'm not going to show any graphic depictions, but if things happen, I will have to cover them, so be careful. I have the same disclaimer as before. I am not a member of the nationality and ethnicity featured in this book, thus I will not fully understand the complexities of their culture and society, but by doing some research about the author, I hope to find an approximate point of view to be able to discuss this book and the techniques featured that will honor the author and her work within my different point of view. This book covers topics that many people would feel uncomfortable about regarding slavery, racism, and colonialism, so if my discussion of these topics is inadequate or uninformed, I do apologize for that. I am a white-passing Latino male. Especially regarding the oppression of African Americans both in the past and currently, I do not want to speak for anybody or speak over anybody or reduce any voices. I'll link in the description a video by YouTuber Sarah Says, Rachel Ayo, and the BBC News Africa that is reviewing or saying their thoughts and perspectives of Homegoing, coming at it with the perspective of someone who is either African American or African, and so I want to elevate these voices and not replace them. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's TED Talk, which I have linked in the description, is a great speech about understanding others and getting new perspectives. It really influenced me. That I think, if I remember correctly, I did watch that. I remember watching it in my sophomore year class. I was supposed to be doing Photoshop class, but I finished, and so I was doing other classwork. And I think one of my classes was to watch this video, and so I remember watching her video in the computer lab. And it really inspiring me, and which is why part of the reason why I started reading all of these books from foreign locations, foreign authors. So I've linked that in the description. A lot of the quotes that I got of Yaa Gyasi, I have from interviews and videos she's done after publishing Homegoing. And as well, another story that I want to promote is the short story collection Friday Black by Nana Kwame Ajay Brenya. I'm so sorry if I pronounced it incorrectly, which is also a great collection of Black-centered stories. I read it for a class, and it has one of the best short stories I've ever read in terms of sci-fi horror, which was, it's called In the Flash, I believe? Through the Flash. It's literally the last one in this. It's so good. And Zimmerland, Friday Black are the ones I remember from this as well. How to Sell a Jacket by As Told by Ice King. Also amazing stories in here that are Black-centered and talk about society at large. And so this is also a book that I would recommend as well. Oh, I forgot that I have this here. This is Chimamanda Ngozi's Americana, which is, I bought it when I read it. I don't remember that much of it, but I have it, and I have the thing around your neck in my shelf outside because it's one of the best books, and that's where the best books that I have are placed in my apartment. So yeah, Yaa Gyasi herself was born in 1989 in Mampong, Ghana, and had emigrated to the United States at 2 years old when her father began studying at Ohio State. And they moved another 2 times to Illinois and Tennessee, and eventually they established in Huntsville, Alabama when she was 9 years old. Her father joined the French department of the University of Alabama. Growing up in Alabama was difficult for Yesi. Whenever they moved, her father would take a phone book and look for any names that looked or sounded Ghanaian, and he would call them and greet them to create a community. However, in Huntsville, there was only one other Ghanaian family, so Yesi didn't have a large community of other Ghanaians or other Africans that she and her family could be a part of, and she had to go to a majority white school. In an author interview by Terry Gross for NPR, Yesi says, "What you miss out on by not being surrounded by people who look like you is a quality that's harder to quantify, harder to talk about, but there is still a loss there." Yessie also had a complicated relationship with her ethnicity and race. Quote, I felt this kind of disconnect from the Black community as well. Her parents had had a complex idea of ethnicity, being West African and Ghanaian more than African American. In an article interview of Yaa Gyasi written by Sam Scott for Stanford Magazine, which I've also linked in the description, Yessie is described as being conflicted with this idea of ethnicity. She grew up feeling not Ghanaian enough to be Ghanaian and not African American enough to be African American. Yessie would enroll into Stanford, which is where why this magazine made this interview, and began writing a novel which would become Transcended Kingdom, which she published a few years after Homegoing. In preparation for the book and for research, she visits Ghana during her sophomore year, and a friend got her to tour the Cape Coast Castle, which was a settlement created by the Portuguese in the 1500s, I believe, for trade, and then became a slave trade center when it was taken by the British. There, she would learn about local Ghanaian women who'd marry British soldiers and live in the castle, while directly below them, men and women would be placed into dungeons and sold into slavery. From an interview on Q with Tom Power, linked in the description, Yessie tells of her reaction to learning about the Cape Coast Castle.
Yeah, I was really angry, I think, was actually the first reaction that I had was a lot of rage and also just grief. It was hard for me to picture what it might have been like for a person to be in a space like that with no air and no light for months at a time.
From the Stanford magazine, quote, buffeted by images of such wildly disparate fates unfolding floors apart, Yessie's mind began racing with ideas for a far more ambitious book than the one she'd been working on. In her journal that night, she wrote that she was scared of how much research lay ahead. And this book is very ambitious and it manages to hit that ambition. When Yessie began writing for Homegoing, her research was much more difficult than actually writing the book. For the NPR interview, she said, the fact of the matter is that for every painful thing that happens in homegoing, there's an equally painful or far worse thing that happened to a real person. It was hard for her to read about the past. Quote, but I think as long as I approached it as an opportunity, again, to kind of resurrect the lives of characters who might have gone through these situations, honor these lives, doing the writing felt in some ways as an act of love and justice. She had also smartly, deliberately kept Homegoing short. Writing a larger story would make the historical parts of the story less immediate in the minds of the audience when finishing reading the book. Quote, I felt really strongly that something would be lost. This sense of expediency, of urgency, this sense of just the sweep of time that we are all caught up in, would be lost if this novel was thousands of pages long. In the Q with Tom Power interview, she talks about the importance of the story ending in the present day.
Well, with Homegoing, it was really important to me that the novel end in the present because I didn't want this to kind of be the kind of book where you could leave it saying, you know, slavery was a million years ago and it has no bearing on our lives today. Like, I wanted it to be very clear all of the ways that slavery has kind of come to leave a lasting legacy on American history, on Ghanaian history, and on many other countries' histories.
Yessie wanted to explore the idea of the hugeness of history versus the presence of an individual. From the Stanford article, she says, quote, the present is not separate from history. It is a part of history. In an interview with Penguin Books UK, linked in the description, Yessie is asked if there's any specific message she wants people to take away from this book. And she says this.
I suppose if I had to say anything, it's that you know, all of these kind of traumatic moments that we look at in our history, they happened to people, to individuals just like us, and that it's important to not look back on those moments and just think about people as this kind of mass, this kind of faceless mass, to remember to put names and faces to each of these experiences.
Yessie wanted to honor the people she researched when writing. The impact of this book after it was finally written and published has been amazing. From the Stanford magazine, one of the unexpected and touching responses she received from African American readers is that the book prompted them to get DNA genealogical testing to get a sense of what it is otherwise impossible to know, where they came from. In 2016, Homegoing was included in Stanford's assignments for incoming freshmen. Homegoing won a litany of awards. In 2016, the year it was published, it won the National Book Critics Circle's John Lennon Award for Best First Book, and Gyasi was named by National Book Foundation's 5 Under 35. Homegoing also got a shout out from the successful writer and journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates, author of Between the World and Me. In 2017, it won the American Book Award, also Granta's Best of Young American Novelists, and the PEN Hemingway Award. In 2020, Yaa Gyasi won the Vilkek Prize for Creative Promise in Literature and the Great Immigrants Award by Carnegie Corporation of New York. In 2021, Gyasi's Transcendent Kingdom was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction, and most recently, she was named as an international writer by the Royal Society of Literature. That's a lot. Yaa Gyasi wrote an amazing book, and I cannot wait to share it with you. Please, please read this book. It rightfully deserves the acclaim and awards it gained. So please look into it. It's just amazing. And my covering of it, just like the other two books I've done, my covering of it does not in any way make up for having read it. So the story itself, the Homegoing comprises 14 chapters split into 2 equal parts with 7 chapters each, and each chapter is named after the character it covers. It spans from the late 1700s to 2000, almost 300 years of history within 300 pages. Several historical moments are covered, while others are omitted. There's no mention of world wars, which was really funny. It doesn't detract from the book. It's just kind of funny that none of the world wars were mentioned. Each character is in a third-person limited point of view, stuck within the mind and perspective of each individual character. The chapters alternate between the strands of the family tree. This is the original family tree before I annotated it. Each character in each pair is their contemporary, so sometimes I may mention contemporary pairs. For example, Effia, chapter 1, and Esi, chapter 2, are contemporaries to each other. This is my recreation of the family tree in my notebook, just so I can have it in my notebook. And I'll show the annotated original family tree in the book and my simplified annotated family tree later. Like I said before, Gyasi was able to write compelling characters that we get invested in very, very quickly. Each chapter is functionally a short story, able to stand apart from each other, but overall must be taken in context with the adjacent chapters and characters. First, a beginner's dive into writing compelling characters. The basic ways to be able to write compelling, interesting, and empathetic characters is to use elements of conflict, wants and needs that they must work to reach towards, thematic and story-driven goals that they must try to reach towards as well, internal lies, antagonists, and external obstacles that they must overcome. All these elements don't have to be used at the same time, and not all of these elements are present within Homegoing's chapters, but using any combination of these can help make a good character struggle and make us want to continue reading. And separate from creating a compelling character, Gyasi also makes each character unique, having separate wants, needs, circumstances, social positions, frames of mind, and personalities. Sometimes the interesting and unique attributes of one character are juxtaposed, emphasized, or compared to another character. And so highlighting aspects of both of these stories or personalities makes it slightly more interesting as well. There are also some themes throughout the book that create an interesting connective tissue between chapters. There's not an overarching, thematic idea throughout each of the chapters because it is a loose telling of history passing through. But some things can be pulled apart that I have noticed. One I will focus on is the theme of stories and myths. Several times throughout the books, characters are told fictional myths or true stories, and they are affected by them, making them learn something or do something because of them. It's not that common, but if it is, I'll point it out. There are also common motifs of fire and water, usually the ocean, that connect the characters together in a more aesthetic way because of the mention of fire and water, blue and red. Another theme that I wasn't really able to annotate much in my notes, that is the idea of metaphysical inheritance of concepts like pain, trauma, and luck. And so I will try to write about it when it pops up. But that's not one of my focuses. There is a definite physical inheritance of children taking something physical from their parents, or like social class inheritance. But that's less thematic in my mind and more plot relevant. I mean, it is thematic in some ways, but it's mostly plot relevant. So it'll appear, I'll talk about those when I talk about plot moments. This is why this video is going to be so long. I will be going through each character's chapter, detailing their story, and showing how Yaa Gyasi uses the aforementioned writing elements, the connections between the characters, and interesting themes and motifs, all to create compelling characters and an overall amazing and emotional story. I'm going to be discuss, or at least when I wrote this, I've structured it in pairs, and so I'll be talking about the first person of the pair story, talk about it, and then the second person of the pair story, talk about it. And that's how I have it structured, at least help me when I edit. I'll summarize Effia's story. It is 1760, and a large fire burns through Ghana, stretching from the coast of Fantiland to central Asanteland. Effia Archer is born while the fire rages, and her father, Kobe Archer, hands her over to his first wife, Baba. The fire destroys much of the farmland, and Effia is seen as born from the fire itself. Throughout her youth, Baba abuses Effia for the smallest wrongs, while also giving birth to her brother Fifi, whom she dotes on. Kobe plans for Effia to be royal and wants to marry her to the next chief, Abiku Badu. The Fonte frequently trade with the British, food, animals, and slaves, which makes them a prominent partner for Effia's village, the British. Local Fanti women are married off to white soldiers living in the Cape Coast castle away from other Fanti people. When Abiku plans to marry Effia after she has her first period, entering womanhood, Baba tells Effia to hide her first blood. When Effia lingers within childhood, Baba and Kobe decide to marry her off to the governor of the Cape Coast castle because Abiku will not marry her. In 1776, Effia marries James Collins and moves into the castle. She and the other Fanti wives live comfortable lives, and Effia struggles to give James a child. After 2 years, Fifi sends Effia a letter to let her know Kobe is dying, and she visits her village. She is also now pregnant. Fifi tells Effia that Baba is not her real mother, and that her real mother was a slave house girl that Kobe had raped. She had fled during the fire, leaving a black stone pendant that Baba gave her before she moved away. In the end, Kobe dies from his illness, and Baba curses Effia's lineage. Effia is the first story we read of part 1, and it is, in my opinion, the strongest story. It has to be. We follow Effia through her birth and childhood up into her adulthood right before her pregnancy. And as the first story, it sets up some prominent elements that return throughout the book. The black pendant, the idea of a curse from fire, and some focus on the ocean itself. Some of the elements used to make Effia a compelling character are very well implemented. There are multiple compelling conflicts that Effia has to deal with. And one of them, the first one, is between Effia and Baba, who is her primary antagonist. Effia is a naive young girl and believes her mother loves her, obviously, because it's her mother, despite the abuse that she gets. Effia and Kobe want her to be Abiku's wife, who will ascend into royalty soon once the current chief dies. He's going to die soon. And their culture has taboos around marriage, so he can't marry her until Effia becomes a woman, parentheses, gets her period. Her first period. Baba doesn't love her, and Effia and the audience believe Baba to be her mother, and while the audience can see the hypocrisy of Baba, Effia can't. Baba abusing Effia in her childhood, tricking her to hide her period, and her ceasing her abuse to convince Effia to follow her lie to hide her period, all make us care for Effia to tell her, like, hey, look, something bad's happening to you. Effia wants to believe Baba despite the suffering she's caused. She didn't take them at first, but when she looked up again, there was something like desperation in her mother's eyes. And because the look had softened Baba's face somehow, and because Effia also knew the desperation, that fruit of longing, she did as she was told. This shows Effia having a caring sensibility, which endears us further to her. Along with this compelling conflict, there is a lie and a story used against Effia, or a myth. The fire that occurred during Effia's birth is very integral to the entire birth, along with Effia's story itself. Kobe knew then that the memory of the fire that burned, then fled, would haunt him, his children, and his children's children for as long as the line continued. This would be an accurate statement for the future. In regards to Effia, being born in fire haunts her, and Baba doesn't have milk when Effia is born because her body was not preparing for pregnancy. But the villagers didn't know that, and they used the fire to explain that. When Effia follows Baba's deception and doesn't announce her becoming a woman, Baba uses the fire as an explanation for it. I tell you, husband, I think she was cursed in that fire, a demon who will never become a woman. Think about it. What creature is that beautiful but cannot be touched? All of the signs of womanhood are there, and yet still nothing. The white man will marry her regardless. He does not know what she is. This combination of Baba's deception and Effia's born of fire myth leads to Baba succeeding in this conflict, and Effia failing to get what she wants, marrying Abiku. She doesn't marry him, and instead, Kobe marries her off to James Collins. Baba, Kobe, and Abiku use her marriage to ensure better trade relations between Fanteland and the British. In the end, Baba succeeds further by exiling Effia. And when Baba finally pulled away, Effia could see something like relief dancing in her smile. We see Effia fail in this conflict, and we want to see Effia succeed further in her life. She struggles with learning about the slave trade, knowing about James's white family in England, and her own fertility. When she tours the castle, she watches the boats in the ocean. Cargo ships, like black specks of dust in the blue wet eye of the Atlantic, floated so far out it was difficult to tell how far away from the castle the ships actually were. Some were maybe 3 days away, others merely an hour. It's not focused here, but the ocean is introduced as a concept, obviously because of the slave ships. After marriage, another compelling conflict begins. James expresses his want for a child, and Effia worries that she won't be able to give one to him. She begins to believe in the lie that Baba told, that the curse, though a lie, may have some truth in it. She remembered Kobe's judgment of mixed-race marriages, saying that marriage joins two families, and they have no way of knowing what sins the white men carry. Baba had said that Effia's curse was one of a failed womanhood, but it was Kobe who had prophesied about a sullied lineage. Effia couldn't help but think she was fighting against her own womb, fighting against defied children. After her previous failure, Effia, believing in this lie, makes us root for her to overcome it. She asks another Fante wife to help her get pregnant, and she gives her a root that she must hide on her bed. When James finds out and calls it black magic, her friend says it won't work, and Effia accepts her infertility, believing in a worse lie, that she is truly cursed. Eventually, Effia does get pregnant, succeeding in her want and no longer believing in the lie of her fire curse. Finally, Effia is able to succeed in a conflict, which gives the audience closure and contentment. At the end of her chapter, another escalating conflict is introduced, one that stretches over the entire book in a thematic way. Kobe dies, and Baba curses Effia. You are nothing from nowhere, no mother, and now no father. She looked at Effia's stomach and smiled. What can grow from nothing? Another obstacle is placed in front of her. Her lineage will not prosper. That's Baba's curse. And we saw her both succeed and fail against Baba. And so the audience wants to see Effia's lineage prosper. And now on to Esi's story. Esi's story occurs during her imprisonment in the Cape Coast Castle dungeons in late 1770s, where she and other women suffered horrid conditions in imprisonment. Esi Asare's past is revealed through memories. She was the daughter of Big Man Asare and Mame in Asanteland, and their large family lived a happy life, doting on Esi and having a prominent position of power in their village. One day, Big Man had Mame hire a slave girl, a little girl named Abronoma, meaning little dove. She isn't a good servant, and when Big Man attempts to discipline her, Mame interjects and beats her instead to spare a worse punishment, being beaten by Big Man. And so Big Man makes Abernoma carry water from one end of the yard to the tree and back with a bucket on her head. And if any water spills, he'll beat her. And so Esi, Big Man, Mame, and the rest of their village watch Abernoma struggle as she manages to complete the challenge, coming back and forth with the bucket. But in the last moment, 2 drops of water fall out, leading to Big Man beating her harshly. Mame becomes distraught at her pain, which confuses Esi, who tries to apologize to Abernoma. In her anger, she tells Esi that Mame was a slave for a Fanti master who raped her and had a child. Esi wants to befriend Abernoma as an apology for how her father treated her, and Abernoma makes her a deal. Esi will send a message to her father letting her know where Abernoma is and they will not have any bad blood between them. After Esi sends the message, her village is attacked. Mami gives Esi a black stone pendant and tells her that her sister has the other half. Mami then kills herself to avoid being taken by a raid, and Esi flees the violence. She's captured by slavers and marched into Fantaland, where she sees Chief Abiku, who has now descended into Chief, and Fifi, and she's taken to the dungeons. One night, drunk white soldiers come into the dungeon, and one man takes Esi into his room and rapes her. She's returned to the dungeons before being chosen to be sent to America, losing her pendant in the process. Ace's character is memorable and compelling through the use of contrasts and conflicts. While imprisoned, Essie uses stories to help her stay alive, both a salve for her pain, but also a source of pain itself. A fellow slave named Tansy tells her stories, and Essie also remembers her past. Hell was a place of remembering. Each beautiful moment passed through the mind's eye until it fell to the ground like a rotten mango, perfectly useless, uselessly perfect. Using her memories to contrast her current situation internally and thematically makes us care for Essie as we see her loving family and her happy life before being thrown into this hell. The heavily detailed, horrible conditions within dungeons are also enough on their own, without contrasting, to make us empathize and care for Essie and all the women with her. Essie's past within Asanteland delivers some important information regarding her and Effia's mother, Mame. There are little hints here and there that allude to a larger story that we'll get later, but we and Essie have to piece together ourselves in this moment. Abernoma tells her that Mame was raped by Kobe Ocher, and that her reaction to Abernoma's beating was because she knew how it was to be hurt by someone with power for being weak. Other clues are when Essie was born, Mame could not put her down, repeating, "You never know what could happen," alluding to not having Effia missing her other daughter and her sudden departure from Fantaland. Mame is also terrified of fire, alluding to the fire that wrecked Kobe's farm, possibly implying Mame flew into the fire to escape Fantaland, also possibly being traumatized by it. Mame also tells Essie that you can learn anything when you have to learn it. You could learn to fly if it meant you could live another day, which points to Mame's survivability. And finally, when Essie's village is attacked, Mame could not make herself flee, saying she couldn't do it again, which confuses Essie. "I can't do it again," her mother whispered. "No more woods, no more fire." She was rocking back and forth and cradling the fat flap of her stomach in her arms as though it were a child. She gives Essie her pendant, saying she gave one to Baba after she had set the fire, and then keeps repeating, "Sister, Baba, fire," again and again. Before Essie flees, she sees Mame and understands something. Mame was not a whole woman. No matter how much she loved Essie, and no matter how much Essie loved her, they both knew in that moment that love could never return what Mame had lost. Mame would rather die than go through what she went through again. And Essie knew too that her mother would rather die, even if it meant that in her dying, Essie would inherit that unspeakable sense of loss, learn what it meant to be unwhole. Essie and the audience together are able to piece together Mama's backstory, one of running away from suffering by setting a fire, sacrificing her daughter for her own freedom, and the pain that that comes with. Essie's want for knowledge, to know more of Mame's history, mirrors the audience's want for knowledge, especially after Abernoma tells her a bit of what she knows, which connects Essie to us. However, we can see Abernoma's lie and Essie cannot, thus investing us in this conflict, much how Effia could not see Baba's lie. Abernoma suffers from Big Man and tells Esi to send a message to her father in exchange for them to be friends. This conflict between Esi's pure want to know about Mame and befriend Abernoma, with Abernoma's secret want to be free, is compelling. Esi believes in Abernoma's lie and is manipulated to cause her own downfall. If Esi had not sent that message to Abernoma's father, then Abernoma's father wouldn't have not attacked the village, and Esi would have not been captured and sold into slavery. It's unknown if Esi's village would have been raided anyway in the future and would have led to the same conclusion, a more historic-centric view, but thematically, Esi caused her own suffering. Abernoma is another antagonist like Baba who succeeds in what she wants, which is to be free from Big Man Asare. The last thing Esi and the audience sees of Abernoma is her celebrating when Esi's village is attacked. This contrast of Esi and Mama panicking while Abernoma celebrates also heightens their respective emotions. She departs and we never hear from Abernoma again, at least alive. That's foreshadowing. This makes Esi's capture, her march through Fantaland, and imprisonment all the more painful to experience. We sympathize with Esi, putting a face in the faceless suffering that we learn about in history class. Esi brings us into the horror and evil, further honoring those who suffered in history, what she set out to do. In the dungeons, Esi is taken in secret by a soldier and raped, further increasing the injustices and horrors that Esi endures. The soldier is never named and barely described, and we only see his reaction to Esi. He looked at her like her body was his shame. In the past, Esi had glimpsed Mame and Big Man having sex and wanted to understand how it can be both painful and pleasurable. This is a marker of innocence within Esi, something a happy, ahistorical coming of age story would tackle. Then, her rape completely destroys this innocence, as there was no pleasure in the act. And when she returned to the dungeons, she no longer wants to talk to Tansy and no longer wants to listen to her stories. With how much we've sympathized and connected with Esi, and being so close to the ending of a chapter, this is painful to read. Comparing contrasting elements within Effia and Esi's story help us care for each of them more, making them more interesting, as well as carrying over our want towards the next two contemporaries, their children. Abernoma had told Esi about having a half-sister, and she spoke a premonition. In my village, we have a saying about separated sisters. They are like a woman and her reflection, doomed to stay on opposite sides of the pond. This imagery of opposite sides of the pond is reflected with Yesi's view of one sister in the above castle and another sister in the below dungeons. This is evident in their inverse storylines. Effia's childhood is simple, yet with abuse from Babe and insecurity from the fire that haunts her in a lower standing, and then marries James Collins and lives in an affluent life, higher standing. Esi's childhood is full of love and care, with a happy family and prosperous village, a higher standing, and then is captured and sold into slavery, a lower standing. Effia's storyline rises while Esi's storyline falls. And this juxtaposition, I guess I should make it this way, because that's how you're gonna, flip this, yeah, this is it. This juxtaposition, supported by Abernoma's premonition, elevates both Effia's conflicts and Esi's suffering, making their pair storylines even more interesting and interconnected. There's a sad moment that I like. It's sad and it's tragic, but I like the impact of it. That highlights their crossing paths. Within Effia's chapter, Effia had asked James what's below, and he only called slaves cargo in her language, in Tweet. Effia learns that it's people he's talking about and begins to fight him, saying that Kobe warned her about white men and wants to return home, but he subdues her, telling her that she has no home to return to because of the success of Baba's plan. She accepts this truth and doesn't mention it again. Later, the other Fante wives complain about their husbands returning from the dungeons smelling horribly, and one says that the women below them look like them, the wives, and their husbands struggle to tell them apart. Now, Effia begins to think about the slaves underneath her again. She never thought of what James might think every time he saw them. if he went to the dungeons and saw a woman who reminded him of her, who looked like her and smelled like her, if he came back haunted by what he saw. And then later in Essie's chapter, before she is taken to the ships, Governor James, which is what he's called in her chapter, assesses his cargo. He looked at her carefully, then blinked his eyes and shook his head. In this split moment, I believe he saw Effia within Essie, recognizing their relationship and ignoring the instinct, calling back to Effia's thoughts. A subtle moment that's so well written. Another important comparison is in the fate of their pendants. Before her marriage, Baba gives Effia a black stone pendant with gold dust accents and says that it's a piece of her mother. And that's not a true lie, but an omission. Effia believes Baba is her mother, but the rock is Mame's, her actual mother. James Collins makes it into a necklace early in their marriage and a gift that makes her cry and gives her comfort when she touches it. Oh, I should have worn my pendant. Oh well. Essie is given a reciprocal pendant by Mame before she flees her village. She keeps it in her wrapper during her forced march, and when she's presented before Fifi, in an act of rebellion, she spits in his face. He slaps her, which makes the pendant fly off. And in a moment of desperation, Essie swallows the stone to make sure she stays with it. And in the dungeon, she fishes it out of her waist and buries it in the muck. She plans to take it back when she feels it's safe to take it. When James comes into the dungeons, Essie is taken away and she tries to retrieve her buried stone. She flung herself to the ground and started to dig and dig and dig. And then the soldier was lifting her body, and soon all she could feel instead of dirt in her steadily moving hands was air and more air. The simple idea that Effia keeps her pendant but doesn't know about her mother, while Essie knows about her mother but loses her pendant, is just so poignant. Effia doesn't know the stone's history, but cherishes it even after learning that it's not truly Baba's, but her actual mother's, which she doesn't know the name of. Effia and Essie's pendants become a symbol of family and love, and as Essie loses this symbol, we have a divergence in what we become invested in. We want Effia's pendant to continue on so that its progression would somewhat make up for Essie losing hers. As we move forward through the book, their respective children's chapters now have this emotional baggage attached to them. Effia's worry about her lineage and the compelling conflict that comes with it extends to her son, while Essie's suffering and isolation and our emotional connection with her extends to her daughter. This makes it slightly easier to care about these characters in the beginning of their chapters, and the work Gyasi puts into their own individual stories does the rest of the legwork to make us care for these characters. All the characters we end up caring for, our care carries over to a next character. Oh god. Just a slightly bit to help us get primed to care for this character, and that cycle continues over and over. Effia and Essie's stories are so well made that our emotional investment of them carries over the rest of the entire book, making us, or at least me, scramble to learn anything we can about them after the end of their chapter. And this happens again with the other characters as well, wanting to know what happened to the character after the chapter has passed. This occurs with every passing chapter, every passing descendant. This want for knowledge, this want for history, drives the story forward. As the descendant tree grows, the physical connections and thematic connections begin to decrease. There's still some connection between them. That's really fun to discover. Some parallel moments within each character. But we move on to their children. A summary of Quey's chapter. In 1799, Effia's son Quey Collins, working as a junior officer in the Cape Coast Castle, travels to his mother's village to help establish stronger trade with the British. He tries to get Fifi to agree to a contract, but Fifi delays his decision, wanting to hear other deals with the Asantes, the Dutch, and the Portuguese to see which is better. Fifi questions why Quey was sent to England in 1793 when he was 14 years old, and Quey remembers growing up as a lonely child in the Cape Coast Castle with Effia, learning about Baba and Effia's pendant being from her other mother. James gets him to meet Kojo, the son of a chief of a prominent Fonte village, and they quickly become friends. Kojo is athletic and wrestles, while Quey is studious and silent, and Quey begins to feel attraction towards Kojo. One day they wrestle and are locked in an embrace when James discovers them and sends Quey to England. He returns to Ghana at 20, ignoring Kojo's letters to visit, and tries to get Fifi to agree to a deal. In the interim, Fifi invites men from other villages, including Kojo, to set out on a dangerous mission that he won't tell Quey about. Quey doesn't know what they're planning and waits in anticipation for weeks until Fifi returns, wounded but alive. Their mission was successful and was to capture Nana Yaa Yeboah, the daughter of Osei Bonsu, the king of the Asante people. Fifi plans for Quey to marry Nana Yaa to ensure Quey's position within royalty. Quey's chapter is the one story that I remember most after reading it for the first time, for some very obvious reasons. Quey becomes an interesting and compelling character through his internal conflicts, two specific ones that occur at different times, one in 1793 and the other in 1799. I might accidentally say 19-something when I say dates, so sorry about that. Oops. The 1793 conflict is easier to understand. Effia ensures that Quey has a good life, which contrasts how her childhood was, highlighting the differences between their upbringing. However, Effia's attempts to make life easy for Quey causes him conflict as he is sensitive and dependent on Effia and James. James introduces Kojo to Quey in an attempt to make Quey more personable. And in their first interaction, Kojo questions Quey's light skin, saying that they are not similar. He knew that he was one of the half-caste children of the castle, and like the other half-caste children, he could not fully claim either half of himself, neither his father's whiteness nor his mother's blackness, neither England nor the Gold Coast. This, of course, comes from Gyasi's themes of conflicting dual identities. Kojo has a blunt kindness, and they become friends. They race snails, and Quey's snail wins, which makes him worry and be afraid that Kojo will be angry with him and not be his friend anymore. This small worry and lie is refuted by Kojo, who accepts this loss, and it's a small hurdle within Quey that makes us care for him, but also kind of tells a bit more of his character. They named the snails, Quey's winning snail being called Kwame, which is an Asante name, while Kojo's losing snail being Richard, which he explains is a British name since the snail was bad like the British. And they have this internal joke of calling things Richard if they are good or bad throughout their childhood friendship. This friendship between Quey and Kojo is compelling and makes us care for Quey to see that, maintaining this friendship helps him not struggle. And as they grow up, Kojo gets stronger and Quey becomes being attracted to him. Lately, Quey had been thinking about Kojo's arms encircling him, dragging him to the ground, Kojo's body on top of his. One time, Kojo put Quey in a headlock and Quey flushes. Kojo's body was pressed so close to him that he felt for a moment that they were one body. Kojo pushes for Quey to challenge him to wrestle, something Kojo had been excelling at, and their interaction here is telling. "Challenge me," he said, and his breath danced on Quey's own lips. All this is subtext, but it's blatant enough for me. Quey is gay, and with this narration focusing on Quey's senses helps portray this idea without saying it. The knowledge of historical treatment of homosexuals, even current treatment of the LGBT community, goes unsaid here, but it's expected that the audience has this knowledge already. Even without knowing that modern-day Ghana has criminalized homosexuality, we still know that homosexuality has historically been oppressed. Quey is going into this attraction without the knowledge or language to be able to understand it, and this makes us care for his well-being as he begins to worry about it. After an important wrestling match against British soldiers, Quey finally accepts Kojo's challenge to wrestle him. He's easily overpowered and Kojo pins him down. And here, an important, sublime moment occurs. Quey knew that he should tap the ground 3 times, a signal to end the match, but he did not want to. He did not want to. He didn't want Kojo to get up. He didn't want to miss the weight of him. Quey begins to give in to his urges. Slowly, Quey relaxed his body, and he felt Kojo do the same. The boys drank in each other's gazes, their breathing slowed, the feeling on Quey's lips grew stronger, a tingling that threatened to draw his face towards Kojo's. "Get up right now." Quey's father, James, interrupts a moment. He sends Kojo away, and in the next month, James sends Quey to England. The moment is jarring and terrifying, with James being described as looking at Quey with a mixture of measured control, like speaking to servants and slaves, and fear. I don't know to what extent Yaa Gyasi had control over the format of the book, so I don't know if this is the intended effect that was planned for or not. This is the tab. It says gay. So this is the page moment that this last moment happens. Kojo and Quey's moment follows through the bottom of this left page, creating a bubble of intimacy for the entire page. And then James's dialogue comes in right at the top of the next page. It feels like a jump scare, jarring and sudden. It emulates their surprise, having James appear so suddenly, and I believe would not hit this hard if it occurred in the middle of the page. It might have even hit harder if James had appeared on the turn of the page, a very Junji Ito amazing moment. It's more subtle whether Kojo also has these feelings. In 1793, he seems to mirror Quey's intimacy, but it may be Quey's hopeful perspective projecting onto Kojo. And in 1799, Kojo's dialogue with Quey is even more ambiguous, with also less time spent with him. So I can't really say if Kojo was also gay for Quey. In 1799, Quey's conflict becomes more nuanced. He and we know exactly why James sent Quey to England, in the hope that isolating him may somehow remove his homosexual urges. Quey realizes that James shipped his problem away like he does with slaves. How had James felt every time he watched the ship push off? Was it the same mix of fear and shame and loathing that Quey felt for his own flesh, his mutinous desire? This internal doubt, along with his struggle with making a deal with Fifi and his village, creates a nuanced conflict within Quey. Fifi tells Quey to not be weak in the face of his responsibility, which he doubts he can accomplish. His personal doubts plague him, not knowing what to do when Kojo sends him a letter to see him again. He worries that all he suffered from James would amount to nothing. Maybe London had done what his father had hoped it would, but then again, maybe it didn't. His doubt for his abilities is enough pain for him, and he knows that learning that the suffering that he went through didn't change anything might be too overwhelming for him. These internal conflicts swirl around him, making us care for him and hope that he can deal with them. When he does eventually meet Kojo before he and Fifi set off to Ascenteland, Kojo says that Fifi told him that Quey isn't married, which sends Quey down another spiral. He questions if Kojo mentioning his single status is for a reason, if it was a message, if he could be like a third wife. He flip-flops back and forth, worrying about what to do, further clouding Quey's judgment, increasing his doubt that we want him to overcome. It's getting worse for him mentally. When Fifi returns with Nana Ya, Quey doesn't overcome his doubts. In fact, his doubts are covered, buried, and ignored by Fifi's actions. Before, Fifi had claimed Quey as his son, and he does it again while he's healing from this mission. Quey questions why he does this, and Fifi reveals why he had called Quey back to the village and delayed Quey's mission. You were in England too long, Quey. Maybe you had forgotten that here, mothers, sisters, and their sons are most important. If you are a chief, your sister's son is your successor, because your sister was born of your mother, but your wife was not. Your sister's son is more important than even your own son. Since Effia is not even his sister, Baba told him that he didn't owe her anything, but he knew that he was building his village up and needed someone to continue his work. To make up for Baba's actions to Effia, Fifi will ensure that Quey marries Nana Ya. Then, the Asantes will have to accept Quey and his village, and he will become a very powerful man. I will make you become a very powerful man so that even after the white men have all gone from this Gold Coast, and believe me, they will, you will still matter long after the castle walls have crumbled. We do not get any reaction from Quey after this revelation. In a way, the lack of a reaction is answer enough. The last paragraph is the only indicator of Quey's internal thoughts, and it's delivered more like narration, so it becomes a mixture of resignation and reporting. Quey would never go to Kojo's village. He would not be weak. He was in the business of slavery, and sacrifices had to be made. Throughout his story, Quey's doubts build up. about his feelings, about his weaknesses, about his future. All this work was built up to prepare Quey to either overcome his doubts or to succumb to them. And it's very interesting that in the end, everything is out of his hands. Everything was chosen for him by Fifi. And in a way, he accepts this without conflict, almost like he does give in to his doubts, almost like he does succumb to them. He's not strong enough by himself, and so to not be weak, he must give in. And though that might be something bad, it is a satisfying and compelling end to his story. A summary of Ness's chapter. In 1813, Ness Stockham becomes a slave at Thomas Allen Stockham's Alabama plantation. She was sold away from Essie in 1796 and can only guess that she's 25 years old. She's self-isolated from the other slaves, rejecting the romantic advances of Tim Tam, and she's a field slave, as when she first arrived to the plantation, Tom Allen had her dressed as a house slave, and his wife fainted at the sight of Ness's horrible scars over her entire body. Intercut between Ness's time in Alabama, she remembers being in a plantation she only calls Hell, which is owned by the devil. One night, Tim Tam tries to get his young daughter, Pinky, to speak, which she hasn't done since her mother died. Ness defends her, and Pinky latches onto Ness. In Hell, Ness is forced to marry Sam, a new slave freshly arrived from Africa who doesn't obey the devil. After a destructive rampage, Ness tells the devil that she was the cause, and he whips her to an inch of her life. Since then, Sam is subdued and they consummate the marriage. In Tom Allen's plantation, Pinky accidentally gets his white daughter's dress wet, and his white son tries to punish her. Ness interjects, and Tom Allen believes Ness was about to hurt his son, and he promises punishment for Ness, which makes the other slaves worry for her. She doesn't worry much as she remembers Hell once more. She had become pregnant and met Akua, a Fanti slave who promises to help free them. Kojo is born in 1812, and they try to escape in 1813. The devil chases them, and Ness and Sam distract him to allow Akua to take Kojo to be free. The devil hangs Sam and whips Ness, creating the scars that cover her body. A year later, in the Alabama plantation, Ness prays for Kojo's freedom and protection while waiting to be punished again. Ness's story is a microcosm of the cruelty and suffering that slaves underwent. Yes, he uses the omnipresent racism and oppression of the time to make us care for Ness, along with specific elements, slowly revealing parts of Ness's story. In a way, Ness is a mystery slowly unraveling before us, as the most important thing to her and us, Essie's descendants in Kojo, occurred in the past already, and we learn about him as Ness remembers Hell. Even then, the current moment within Tom Allen's plantation is still interesting, with a compelling relationship to make us care about Ness even more. Early on, we learned that Essie became a stoic woman, named Frowny by the other slaves. A continuation of Essie's story, Essie would tell Ness her own stories, but never happy ones. One of them was the big boat. Ness would fall asleep to the images of men being thrown into the ocean like anchors attached to nothing. No land, no people, no worth. Again, imagery about the ocean. Essie would also share a story of a little dove that cursed her, obviously recalling Abernoma, and would tell Ness about losing Mame's stone. Essie's little dove story would help Ness later as she sings a twee tune Essie would sing. She doesn't understand the words, but they are translated for us. The dove has failed, oh what to do? Make her to suffer, or you'll fail too. Akua hears her singing and tells her that she's Asante. The little dove story leads to Ness meeting Akua and the hope of escaping. This connection, the story that Essie told Ness that Ness used to get Kojo free, is filled with emotion. When she was younger, Ness was only called Mame by Essie, a twee word that Essie's master had punished her for. During the whipping, Essie says in perfect English, "My goodness." And because those had been the only English words to escape Essie's mouth without her struggling to find them, she believed that what she was saying must have been something divine, like the gift of her daughter, and so that goodness had turned into simply Ness. In the current day, Ness isolates away from the other slaves, rejects the advances of a handsome slave, and Tom Allen and his wife react strongly to her scars. We begin invested in wanting to know why Ness is solitary and how she got scars ugly enough to frighten another slaver. The other slaves look down at Ness for what they perceive as her thinking she's better than them, and when she doesn't try to refute them or challenge them, this adds to the mystery of why Ness is like that. We want to know what happened. This isolation is challenged when Pinky aligns herself with Ness, which she accepts, and she tells Pinky to not worry what the other slaves think about her not speaking, and Pinky finds a kind space with Ness. This doesn't align with Ness's self-isolation, but it does align with her relationship with Essie. And because Ness understood loss, and because she understood motherlessness and wanting and even silence, she reached for the girl's hand and pulled her down into the bed, further continuing Essie's emotional story. Pinky and Ness's relationship gets us invested in them as we sense something deeper with their connection. This is emphasized when Ness defends Pinky from Tom Jr., to the point where she takes the cane that he had brandished to hit Pinky with, making him stumble to the ground and cry. Tom Allen arrives, and he looks like Ness is about to hit his son, with him crying that she was going to hit him, creating further injustice for Ness. Another aspect that makes us care for her. She maintains a stoic acceptance, which mirrors Essie's, and doesn't worry about the punishment as the other slaves do. All these questions surrounding Ness are answered by her time in hell, which is separated into 3 sections. The first, in which she explains how she learned, or not she, but it explains how she learned to isolate herself. The second, which shows her relationship with Sam and the cruelty they faced. She dreams of the past in this second part, which makes Pinky wake her up, speaking for the first time to try to help Ness come out of her nightmare. This is after Tom Allen's proclamation to punish Ness. The other slaves begin to respect Ness, thankful for helping Pinky speak and worrying for her punishment. It was waiting that bothered her, that had always bothered her. She and Sam had spent so much time waiting. The third section of Hell explains Kojo's birth, their bid to escape on the Underground Railroad, and Ness and Sam's self-sacrifice for Kojo's freedom. The 4 of them had to climb a tree to hide from the devil that pursued them, and Ness and Sam had the same thought at the same time to distract their pursuers, each hoping the other would take care of Kojo. She tells the devil that she killed Kojo, a very believable lie, similar to Mame killing herself to not be captured again, and they are returned to hell. Sam is made to watch Ness be heavily whipped, and then he is hung. This revelation paints Ness's character in a new light, a revelation that adds intent behind her state of being in Tom Allen's plantation. Ness no longer cares for relationships, having spent all she could for Sam and Kojo. She took in Pinky, a surrogate child and a surrogate mother, accepting a connection and protecting her fiercely like a mother would. Her horrid scars come from her sacrifice, and her stoic demeanor comes from having already undergone the worst punishment she could have. Her prayers for Kojo to be protected are the only things she can do, and her current lack of agency is from lack of want. Ness succeeded already in freeing Kojo, and now lives her life ambling around, suffering in slavery and content with her actions. There is satisfaction in knowing that Kojo is free despite Ness's continued oppression. The comparisons between Quey and Ness seem, at first to me, limited, but I do see some significant points that may or may not be purposeful. The biggest contrast is the historical context of the characters, mirroring Abena's pond metaphor. Quey is born into affluence in the Cape Coast castle, the son of a white British governor. He's able to get educated, he's technically free to choose his own path, if he had the balls to, and he's soon married into royalty. On the other side of the pond, Ness is born into slavery. She grew up as a slave, married another slave, and will never be free. The cross destinies of Effia and Esi continue their trajectory through their children. Another contrast occurs with how Effia and Esi feature in these chapters. For Quey, Effia is a prominent character and coddles and cares for him. She tells him of her past, and as he grows up as a single child, he feels lonely. He begins to lament the fact that his family was so small, unlike all the other families in the Gold Coast, where siblings piled on top of siblings in the steady stream of marriages each powerful man consummated. Quey had only himself, his books, the beach, the castle, and his mother. This further informs his character going forward. In some similar and different veins, we have Essie. For Ness, Essie only appears in her childhood, having been separated from her when she was 8 years old. She only remembers Essie being unemotional, not reacting strongly to Ness being taken. She would also associate real love with a hardness of spirit. Ness learns how to be stoic and solitary from Essie and from Hell. A tragic moment further illustrates Essie's lack of emotion. When giving birth to Kojo, Ness remembers the stories of her own birth, of how Nessie never asked anybody for help and went behind a tree. They said a strange sound had preceded Ness's newborn wail, and for years after, Ness had listened to them argue about what that sound was. One slave thought it was a flutter of birds' wings, another that it was a spirit come to help Ness out and then gone with a rumble. Yet another said that the sound had come from Essie herself, that she had gone out to be alone to have her own private moment of joy with her baby before anyone came to snatch both joy and baby away. The sound was Essie laughing, which is why they hadn't recognized it. Essie loved Ness fiercely, probably remembering Mame's joy for herself, and with Ness being taken away, remembering Mame's pain as well. Quey and Ness are interesting characters, continuing the momentum from their mother's chapters, and they've begun steering the family tree further from each other. More than Effia and Essie, Quey and Ness's actions ripple into consequences, both good and bad, for their own children. A summary of James's story. It is 1824, and the Asante people have killed Governor Charles McCarthy and proudly display his head. Quey and his son James Richard Collins learn that James's grandfather, Osei Bonsu, has died, and Nana Yaa wants to travel to Kumasi for his funeral. Quey plans to marry James to the daughter of Chief Abiku's successor, Ama Ata, making him a prince. James is not happy with the arranged marriage and position of power, but has no power to escape the responsibility. In Kumasi, during the funeral, he meets Akosua Mensah, who refuses to shake his hand because he's a slaver. James falls in love with her after talking with her and promises to her that if she hides her period, he'll return to her and elope. James marries Ama Ata in the interim, but can't consummate the marriage, so Ama sends him to apothecary Mampanyan in the hopes that she'll help him. James struggles with knowing what he wants to do, and she tells him that the Asante-British War will decimate Efutu, a different city. After a conversation with Effia about choices, James runs away to Efutu, getting a job with the doctor. Asante warriors attack the village and James is knocked out. When he wakes up, he convinces an Asante warrior that recognized him to tell everyone he died in the war, and then goes and elopes with Akosua. I struggle with James's chapter because, though he does become an interesting character, his personality comes off as ungrateful and apathetic, and thus immature and unlikable, at least in the beginning of the chapter. He doesn't want to marry Ama Ata, dismissing her for small annoyances, and he doesn't want to take up the responsibility that Quey prepares for him. After seeing all that Effia, Fifi, and Quey went through, James' reluctance almost feels like an affront to Effia herself. It would be a realization of a promise that Kobe Archer had made to Effia Archer Collins years ago, that her blood would be joined with the blood of Fante royals. However, two elements are used to make the unlikable immaturity of James still feel compelling. The first is the thing that makes him unlikable, his own conflict about accepting responsibility. Quey frequently includes James into conversations about their people, and James is constantly being called big man or elevated in position, and the future promise of his power all slowly start to wear down at James, and it's evident James is unhappy with his future being paved. He was only 15 when he knew that he could never truly love a woman like that, but it didn't matter what he thought. James's want is countered by Quay's wants, who becomes somewhat like an antagonist to James. This conflict that James faces makes his character empathetic, despite how immature he seems. The second element is James having a very strong sense of identity. James is very passionate. He does not want to be weak like Quey. James insists on going to Kumasi despite the danger of Fantes traveling into warring Asante land. Nana Yaa and Quey argue constantly about Quey's weaknesses and how Fifi made the decision for Quey's family. We see Quey struggling with the consequences of his inaction in the past. Along with this, James makes sure to know the current events with his people. The Asantes blame the British for killing their king to avenge the governor's death, and James questions if this is true, knowing that the British have tried destabilizing the region by inciting wars between tribes. He grows angry with the thought. He also has a strong grasp of how the British slave trade is affecting the Gold Coast. There are rumors that the British will abolish slavery, which they will do in 9 years in 1833, and Quey and James have struggled with knowing what's going to happen. Quey believes that the slave trade will continue despite its abolition. They would just trade one type of shackles for another, trade physical ones that wrapped around wrists and ankles for the invisible ones that wrapped around the mind. James has a strong idea of how the Gold Coast works and how his people will be affected. In terms of history, 1823 was the beginning of the Anglo-Asante Wars, where the Asante Empire fought the British Empire. The war was 5 large conflicts, and the deaths of Governor Charles McCarthy and Osei Bonsu were from the first conflict, lasting from 1823 to 1831. Both of these elements, the conflicts he faces and his strong personality, counteract his immaturity, making sure he's an interesting character. Most of the tension within Quey's story also carries over, helping in our investment of James. Quey's choice of lack of action was a compelling conclusion to his chapter, and seeing James deal with the consequences of this is very interesting. James's middle name is Richard, of course a callback to Quey and Kojo's inside joke, which I feel is the only showing of Quey's want, as if giving James that middle name maintains some of Kojo's connection to Quey. James's chapter is also very complex, as he goes through a lot. It is structured similarly to a fairy or folk tale. A royal travels to a new location and falls in love with the citizen. To marry her, he turns to a witch who helps him reach his goal for a price. The royal and the citizen elope and live happily away from his responsibilities. It feels to me like a fairy tale, at least. The plot is preceded even by a different myth, the tales he's heard from Nana Ya about the trickster spider god Anansi, and his knowledge of what they teach. For they had all heard it many times before, learning then that a story was nothing more than a lie you got away with. This moment foreshadows James's actions. Like any good fairy tale, parts of the plot interact with the protagonist's traits. James's passion for his people is faced with a different point of view of Akosua. She won't shake his hand because he's a slaver. James has spent his whole life listening to his parents argue about who was better, Asante or Fante, but the matter could never come down to slaves. The Asante had power from capturing slaves. The Fante had protection from trading them. If the girl could not shake his hand, then surely she could never touch her own. James's reluctance for his future as a royal is rewarded with a new opportunity. Akosua tells him that she doesn't like how their people have conducted war, and she will be her own nation. If he could, he would join that nation she spoke of. Folklore and fairy tales continuously build onto each other throughout history. Akosua is of a lower status, had nothing and came from nowhere, which reminds James of Effia's worry of Baba's curse being nothing from nowhere. He remembers Effia's past and he uses her story, the one we read, to give him more time. James tells Akosua to hide her period, just as Baba did for Effia, but instead of it being for malice, it's for love. She agrees to hide her pregnancy, but tells him that she won't trust him until he fulfills his promise to return to her. James has a clear want and goal to live with Akosua and live a simpler life, and must find a way around that. He eventually marries his arranged wife, Ama Ata, and either can't or won't have sex with her. I think it's both. She makes him try to fix that, sending him to Mampayan, hopefully in the chance that maybe it'll help him perform. It's almost like the classic meeting of a hero and a witch. James even goes as far to call her that, despite her insistence that she is not a witch. Auntie, they say you make impossible things possible. She laughed again. But they say that about Anansi and Nyame and about the white man. I can only make the possible attainable. Do you see the difference? Mampanyan gives him permission to seek out his goal, telling him about her premonition of Efutu. When James hesitates to go to Efutu, his doubt begins to creep in, again a common trope of fairy tales and folklore. He doesn't know if he can commit to following through with his promise to Akosua and separating from his family. Then Effia visits, and he has an interesting conversation with her that calls back to her and Quey's storylines. But if we do not like the person we have learned to be, should we just sit in front of our fufu doing nothing? I think, James, that maybe it is possible to make a new way. This is the last time we see Effia alive. We never learn when she dies. Effia's talk helps James gain the confidence to pursue his dreams. Effia occupies the position of like a mentor figure in fairy tales and folklore, and it feels amazing that Effia will help continue her own lineage through inspiring James. It's ambiguous whether she understood his reluctance to continue in Quey's legacy, but it's enough to let us know she cares for James and wants what will make him happy. James runs away to Efutu, and after a month of waiting, the Asante attack the village. James flees, bargaining with himself that maybe he could live the life his father laid out for him. He couldn't remember what had been so bad about his old life. He could learn to love Amma. He spent so much time seeing the bad in his parents' marriage that he'd assumed there had to be something better. But what if there wasn't? He had trusted a witch with his happiness, with his life. Now he would surely die. James begins to believe in a lie. So close to the end of his chapter, a quick, small moment that makes it even more complex. But before he can overcome this lie, he's knocked out. When he wakes up, as the Asante warrior drags his supposed dead body, he said that he recognized him and wanted to take his body back to his family. He makes the man promise to lie and tell everyone that James died. That way, he can be free of his responsibilities without causing further shame. This calls back to the Asante quote, about a lie you get away with it. James wanted to leave his family without them knowing, and in his death, he's free to do so. James goes through a large arc throughout his chapter with complex weaving of his internal worries, external actions, and conflicting objectives of the people around him. In the end, having used a myth to set him free, he walks for many days to reach Akosua. She was waiting for him, just as she said, and like a fairy tale, James is able to fulfill the promise he made for her. And now a summary of Kojo's story. In 1850, Ness's son, Kojo Freeman, works as a shipbuilder in Fells Point, Maryland. He's married to Anna Foster, and they live in an apartment with Ma Aku, Kojo's surrogate mother who took him to Baltimore as a free child. Kojo and Anna have 7 children named Agnes, Beula, Cato, Daly, Urias, Felicity, and Gracie, with another on the way, the baby and Anna referred to as Baby H. Anna and Ma'aku clean the house of Mr. Matheson, a white abolitionist. There are rumors of California joining the Union as a free state, with the Civil War brewing in the background. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 is soon to pass, which would allow for law enforcement to arrest any runaway slave in the North and return them to the South, back into slavery. Since Kojo and Ma'aku are true runaway slaves, Matheson warns him to move away to be safer, but Anna is too pregnant to move her. Through the days, Agnes is married and the act is passed. One random day, Anna disappears, and Kojo and Matheson try to find her. A witness saw a carriage pull up next to a heavily pregnant Anna and convince her to take a ride home, which in reality was kidnapping her to the South despite her free papers. Kojo's family dissolves after the tragedy, and 10 years later, Kojo hears about the beginning of the Civil War, feeling helpless. Kojo's chapter is a simple storyline, where James's storyline was complex, and the work done to make us care for Kojo is blatant and obvious, and all the more painful. Of all the stories, Kojo's is probably the most tragic, with the most people affected by the ending. Kojo's adult life is built up around him like a fortress. His love for Anna is clear and beautiful. His care for his multiple children is also clearly presented. They want a child for every letter in the alphabet. And whether they will truly attempt to have 26 children, it's still amazing to be at child H. 8 with H. That's it. Kojo also views Ma'aku as his mother while also knowing about the sacrifice Ness and Sam took to get him free. Kojo and his family become the central focus, a bulwark of love and support. Kojo himself is also interestingly characterized. Like Esi and Ness, he He knows about Ness and Sam as through only stories, but unlike them, he doesn't have a connection to them. He didn't miss what he didn't know, what he couldn't feel in his hands or his heart. And this is understandable, if a bit sad, as he grew up as a freeman. Slavery and the cruelty they suffered is only an abstract to him, a nebulous evil he has never experienced but has run away from. Everyone calls him Joe, but Matheson makes a point to call him by his full name, and Kojo doesn't understand why. Taking away your name is a first step, he said somberly. So somberly that Joe hadn't felt it wise to ask what he was thinking. The first step to what? Kojo isn't well educated, and nor does he worry about it. He has a happy life with his family, so what does it matter? I believe the first step is to dehumanize Black people, is what Matheson was trying to talk about. Kojo is the first person in the family tree since Effia and Esi to begin with a happy life. Kojo wants to be a good father, as Sam wasn't able to be any kind of father for him. He had made a promise to Anna that he would be there for them, the way his own father had not been able to be there for him. Kojo cares for his children and helps them flourish. He's a kind man, helping an old white lady who had almost been hit by a carriage. There's just this one moment where he helps that old white lady. That's important for later, but whatever. He works in a shipyard building ships with his friend Poot, who helps him stamp down an accidental fire Kojo started. That, another quick mention of fire there. They don't focus on the fire there, but it's a reoccurring motif enough to me, like, yeah, they talk about fire here, so here it is. In regards to the ships, Ma'aku dislikes him and other Black men building ships. She said that there was something evil about them building up the things that had brought them to America in the first place, the very things that had tried to drag them under. This is a tangential connection to the ocean now. Ma'aku is his only connection to his Asante roots, telling him about the Gold Coast culture and people. When the Fugitive Slave Act nears, we begin to fear that Kojo will be taken away. Ma'aku had heard that Ness's devil, or the devil that Ness was afraid of, had died a few years ago, but they still prepare with free papers. Ma'aku and Kojo have forged free papers, while Anna and all the children are truly free. As the fear begins, there's a moment of foreshadowing where Beula has a nightmare story, and Kojo watches her moving in her sleep, running in her bed. Maybe Beula was seeing something more clearly on the night she had those dreams. A little Black child fighting in her sleep against an opponent she couldn't name come morning, because in the light that opponent just looked like the world around her. Intangible evil, unspeakable unfairness. Matheson warns Kojo to move his family and Ma'aku to farther north to avoid being captured again. But Anna is too pregnant, and Ma'aku won't leave Baltimore. Agnes gets married, a momentous occasion that is juxtaposed against the passing of the Slave Act. Kojo makes his children prepare for dealing with the police, which is the only true fear he has. At the beginning of the chapter, he had his friend Poot stand in for him when police came to the shipyard to question all the Black men who worked there about a recent robbery, even though the witness or the suspect was white. They still questioned all the Black men there. He was always jumpy around police or anyone in uniform. Ma'aku said he'd been like that since their days in the woods, running from catchers from town to town until they'd hit the safe house in Maryland. With his children, he tries to teach them how to deal with a policeman asking for their papers. However, they don't feel the fear that he felt. Joe worked hard so that his children wouldn't have to inherit his fear, but now he wished they had just the tiniest morsel of it. Another instance of inheriting a concept. Throughout the story, the characters focus on Kojo and Ma'aku being recaptured. Kojo knows that Ma'aku would not allow herself to be captured again. When he was a child, Joe would often marvel at the knife Ma'aku always tucked inside her wrapper, which she'd been keeping inside her wrapper since her days as an Asante slave, then American slave, and then finally free. Like Mame, Ma'aku would take her life before becoming a slave again. But Kojo has so much to live for, a family and a life, that his kidnapping is what we worry about. This is why the injustice of Anna's kidnapping hurts the most. For all the preparation, all the hope that free papers could help them, Anna is still taken, along with unborn baby H. Kojo, holding his fortunes around him, loses the very foundation of it, his wife, and from there the tragedy follows. Seeing the beautiful life be destroyed and not able to get her back is heartbreaking to experience. Kojo takes a painting of Anna around to show people, asking if they've seen her, and he scares a white woman, an inverse reflection to him kindly helping a different white woman earlier in the chapter. This attracts the attention of a policeman who harasses Kojo but ultimately lets him go. This moment, Kojo feels intense fear. The policeman turned and walked away, and the quaking that had been held somewhere inside Joe's bones started to escape until he was sitting on the hard ground, trying to hold himself together. After learning of Anna's kidnapping from the witness, Joe cries in Maku's arms, remembering the stories she told him of Ness and Sam. She tells him their story, keeping them alive in his memory. Joe used to worry that his family tree had been cut off, lost forever. He would never truly know who his people were and who their people were before them, and if there were stories to be heard about where he had come from, he would never hear them. From Ma'aku, he learns about the Fantes of the coast, the Asantes of the inland, and the Akans, the overall people of the Gold Coast. This makes the next chapter even more painful, but that's a later moment. In the end of the chapter, Kojo's family drifts away after 10 years, and the Civil War begins. Kojo, having started the chapter at such an amazing point in his life, has lost all that he cared for and loved. The Civil War begins, and Kojo can't bring himself to feel anything. His loss of his joy and his family is an incredibly tragic ending. These last four characters in textual order, Quey, Ness, James, and Kojo, create an interesting bubble. These characters don't interact with each other, but these four characters create a conversation about slavery. Quey becomes a slaver, accepting slavery, which transitions into Ness, who is a slave. We follow with James, who rejects slavery, which transitions into Kojo, who's free. Obviously, they have no power in the larger scheme of the world, but metatextually, they present the evil of slavery from all aspects, ultimately rejecting it in Kojo's story. A summary of Abena's chapter. In 1871, James's daughter, Abena Collins, tries to help her father, only called unlucky, grow crops in his infertile farm. She's 25 and unmarried, as the man that she loves, Ohin Nyarko, deems marrying her an economic risk he won't face. Frustrated with her life, Abena wants to travel to Kumasi before she dies, but her parents refuse to take her. She turns to Ohin instead, and they travel to Kumasi, where a man mistakes Abena for James, who she doesn't know is her father. She experiences and runs away from a white missionary trying to recruit him for his church. Abena and Ohin return home, stopping in a cave and having sex. They continue seeing each other openly, and when the entire village's crops don't grow for several years, they blame Abena and Ohin's extramarital affair. An ultimatum is placed on Abena. If she becomes pregnant or the crops fail to grow for 7 years, Abena will be exiled. If the crops succeed before then, Abena will be able to stay and get married to Ohin. In 1879, Ohin travels to Osu and introduces cocoa beans to their village. The crops prove successful and the village is saved from economic ruin. Ohin promised an Osu farmer to marry his daughter in exchange for the beans, so Abena has to wait even longer to get married. Secretly pregnant, Abena tells her father she's leaving, and he gives her Effia's necklace. She leaves the farm and goes to Kumasi and enters the missionary church. Abena's chapter is very interesting because of the complex interactions between characters and a very, very strong want. An unmarried 25-year-old woman was unheard of in her village or any other on this continent or the next. But there were only a few men in her village, and none of them wanted to take a chance with Unlucky's daughter. Abena wants to get married, specifically with Ohin Nyarko, and her father's crops not growing is an obstacle. Both Ohin and Unlucky are antagonists to Abena's goals, from Ohin's reluctance to James's consequences. Abena never knows about James's real name, only calling him Unlucky, or Old Man, or just Father. Abena believes she's inherited his bad luck. Sometimes she believes she is her father's own curse. When she says she wants to go to Kumasi, Unlucky forbids it, even going as far as slapping her when she fights back, a thing he's never done. Both James and Akosua treat Abena with heavy respect, including her in every of their important conversations. In a reflection of James's strong personality, Abena claims her own. "Am I not an Asante?" she asked. daring him to tell her the truth, to explain the Fante in his accent, the white in his skin. She grew proud of the Asantes after learning of the ongoing Anglo-Asante War, which currently, historically, is right before the third conflict, which would start in 1873 and last a full year. Abena believed that their reluctance to go to Kumasi was because they were exiled or wanted for a crime, but Akosua tells her the truth of James running from his home. He was a son of a big man, the grandson of two very big men, and he wanted to live a life for himself instead of a life that was chosen for him. He wanted his children to be able to do the same. This enrages Abena. His decision had meant her shame, her unmarried, childless shame. Abena's chapter is almost a direct response to James's chapter, dealing with the aftermath of his choice to become a farmer. Abena's conflict, however, comes from the infertility of the farm, not his choices. She only believes it's his fault from superstition. The village will later believe it's Abena's fault that their crops won't grow, superstition about extramarital affairs. The chapter's true response to James's choices comes in a very small moment, where Abena reflects on James and Akosua's love for each other. Everyone in the village had always laughed at her parents, saying that Unlucky was too poor to get a second wife, but Abena knew the truth. That on those nights when she had slept on the far side of their small hut, pretending not to listen, she could hear her father whisper, "Akosua, you are my one and only." Despite their failure to have a prosperous life, James and Akosua never sought that to begin with. They wanted to live with each other, and they succeeded. Abena's biggest conflict is in Ohin's resistance to marrying her. He already has another wife and many sons, and is a powerful and respected man within their small village, despite not having there's not really any position of power in that village. Abena is near desperate to get married to him, and she asks him to take her to Kumasi as traveling alone would be too dangerous being a single woman. She guilts him to get him to take her to Kumasi. "If you have not married me by now, you will never marry me," Abena whispered, surprised at the hard lump that had so quickly formed in her throat. A very clear desire. Abena wants to visit Kumasi in an attempt to understand her past and her Asante roots further, to glean some sort of revelation about herself and her family, perhaps what it is that's causing their bad luck. But the biggest events in Kumasi don't deliver that big revelation for her. Her visit does introduce the golden stool, an important object to their culture that contains the soul of the entire Asante nation, which becomes an important thing in a later chapter. We'll get back to that. An old man mistakes her for James, asking if she's a ghost, saying he never believed James died in the war. We don't recognize this man. They never describe him, so we don't really know who it is. But yeah, he recognizes James within Abena. Ohin shooed him away, and this could have been a revelation for her, but Abena not knowing that her father is named James doesn't allow for anything further. The most important moment is when she sees a white person for the first time. She knows that they are called Abroni, meaning wicked one, because of the slave trade, colonialism, and war the British had subjected the Golden Coast to. White men are no longer welcome, but a missionary is attempting to establish a church. Abena runs from him, and he tells her to find them if she needs them. This establishes why she returns to them at the end of her chapter, because he said, "Hey, if you need anything, we are here." That's a fucking lie. When she tells Ohin of the missionary, we learn more about her village's mistrust of Europeans. The locals are so disconnected from the conflict and their history that when someone is taken by the slave trade, they do not know where they go to or why. But Unlucky, James, does know. There's a castle on the coast in Fantaland called the Cape Coast Castle. That is where they used to keep slaves before they sent them away to Aburukiri, America, Jamaica. Asante traders would bring in their captives. Fantes, or Ga middlemen would hold them and then sell them to the British or the Dutch or whoever was paying the most at the time. Everyone was responsible. We all were. We all are. This is a continuation of James's changed view from his chapter. Aburukiri is abroad in Twi. Abena's true conflict, the one that elevates her character further, comes after her return from Kumasi. Ohin has them stop to rest in a cave, and Abena is itching to get back as she wants to share her travels with her parents. While resting, she asks Ohin why he won't marry her, and he reiterates that he'll marry her once he has a big harvest. He tells her to be patient, and she struggles with patience. Ohin kisses her, and they have sex. The story that Abena's chapter focuses on is in a moment in the past with her father, where Abena tried to bring enough water for his crops, but they died anyway. She had cried, and James had asked her what she would have done if she knew it wasn't enough, and she says that she would have brought more water. He said to her, "The next time bring more water, but don't cry for this time. There should be no room in your life for regret. If in the moment of doing you felt clarity, you felt certainty, then why feel regret later?" He says this almost for himself as well. Abena keeps this advice close to heart when she accepts her affair with Ohin and with the events to come. Through 2 years of their affair, Abena never conceives a child. With the first year that Ohin's crops didn't grow, their marriage was once more pushed back, further frustrating Abena. Like I mentioned prior, Abena's affair with Ohin is blamed for the barrenness of the farms in her village. The elders gather to discuss the situation. Ohin had publicly announced his intention to marry Abena, but only after a good harvest, so the affair was fine when it was just in private. They saw no harm in that, but they could not let the fornication go unpunished, lest the children grow up to think such things were acceptable, lest the more superstition among them continue to blame Abena for the faults of the land. They place the complicated ultimatum: exile if pregnant, or 7 years of bad harvests. Very complicated ultimatum. Abena's parents had tried to undo the ultimatum to protect Abena, but failed to. Abena had shamed them, but they still love her fiercely. The idea of an inheritance also continues here. Now their only solace was the fact that it seemed Abena had inherited her mother's supposed barrenness, or old man's family curse, or whatever it is that kept her from conceiving a child. If she gets pregnant, she's gone. Through 6 years, Abena's impending exile hangs over her as she watches Ohin trying to have a good harvest. A ticking clock, a new element that adds tension and stakes for Abena. Kojo had something like a ticking clock, but it was less something's coming in terms of something is coming, the slave act, it has arrived, and now what's going to happen. But this is like the true ticking clock. Something needs to happen before the clock goes off and Abena is exiled. When Ohin brings new cocoa beans, the villagers, Abena, and the audience all wait in anticipation to see if it even works. There's a moment where Abena has to comfort Ohin, who has doubts about the cocoa seeds. This moment of sympathy from Abena aiding her character, just characterization in general. I think it's crazy that Abena has to console Ohin after stringing her along, but that's neither here nor there. Throughout the chapters, the point of view sticks with the respective characters and sometimes briefly dips into an omniscient view, showing the audience events that the characters didn't see or notice. It's rare, such as Kobe telling Baba not to speak of Effia's birth. It happens here again. "Shh, stop that talk," she said. "They will sell. They have to sell." But he kept crying and shaking so that she could not hear him when he said, "I'm afraid of that too," and she would not have understood even if she had. This introduces a dramatic irony where the audience knows that Ohin is afraid of success, which casts Abena's goal in shadow, as we don't know how this would affect her. The cocoa seeds eventually do sell and sell well, and what should be an occasion of celebration for Abena and the audience is only celebrated by the other villagers. Ohin is cold towards her, avoiding her, and with the dramatic irony of before, we can see the change before Abena does, making us empathize with her confusion and anger. Abena suspects she's pregnant, being 4 days late to her period, but she withholds her announcement until it's more apparent. It's happened before, being late. But after dealing with so much frustration at the hands of Ohin, we want her to be able to marry him. But Ohin acts different. When she tries to confront him, he tells her not to cause a scene, and she returns to her home alone, crying and devastated. She knows, without him saying, that he won't marry her. And when the elders tell her she won't be exiled, they learn about his promise to marry the Osu farmer's daughter. I accidentally wrote in my script, they learn about his promise to marry the Osu farmer, whatever. His promise makes them have to push their marriage further in the future. Abena cannot deal with more waiting. And we can understand her devastation and anger. We also feel this anger and frustration, having felt all the anticipation and all the tension that the exile and the struggle with the crops caused. Abena decides to leave, heading towards a missionary church as she had before, needing some place to stay. Before she leaves, Unlucky digs up a black stone necklace. When he was given this land, he buried it at the edge to give thanks. He tells her it belonged to her great-grandmother, Effia. It was the first time she had heard the name of one of her ancestors, and she savored the taste of the name on her tongue. She wanted to say it again and again. Effia, Effia. She wears it as she leaves. We didn't see James take Effia's necklace, but we did see her show it to him. I didn't mention it before because it was a really quick moment, but yeah, she showed it to him, and it's entirely reasonable to assume that after Effia and James's conversation about making a new way, she had given it to him as a blessing. From here, Effia's necklace gets even more of a focus, as Quey had only really seen it, never really owning it. Now, Effia's necklace is passed down child after child, sometimes skipping generations, but still very present within the family lineage. A summary of H's chapter. In 1880, Kojo's son, H. Black, is arrested for ogling a white woman, something he denies. H is charged with something, but they won't tell him what, and he has to pay a fine, money he doesn't have. He doesn't have anybody to help him, having separating from F. Jackson after cheating on her and not having any family, so he's jailed and taken to the coal mines outside of Birmingham. H toils under the convict leasing system, sentenced for 10 years, earning a reputation for himself for being able to use 2 shovels at one time. His sentence was reduced by 1 year for his hard work and skill, and becomes a freeman once more in 1889. Now, 39 years old, H moves to Pratt City, and with help from a former convict he had befriended, Josie, he begins working in a mine as a paid laborer. He joins the miners' union and uses his influence to strengthen it, helping in a strike that succeeds in earning them better wages and accommodations. H sends a letter to F, who appears months later at the house he had built, challenging him to accept her love, and they start a family together. H's chapter is a very strong showcase of character. We experience many years with H and can see how the events that occur to him change him and how he reacts in turn. H begins as a passive character and ends as an active character, and this shift makes him more interesting and compelling. Yaa Gyasi talked a lot about the convict leasing system in her interviews, and this is when we start getting into that. The convict leasing system grew within the southern states after the Civil War, where states would lease prisoners to private companies for labor, effectively another form of slavery. White men were subjected to this system, but Jim Crow laws would heavily target black men. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery and was passed in January of 1865 and ratified in December of that year. The amendment has a clause: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. This allowed for states to subject convicts to forced labor, which wasn't abolished until 1941 by Franklin D. Roosevelt and Attorney General Francis Biddle. However, this only abolished states' involvement, and the increased privatization of prisons allowed for modern-day prison labor to continue. If you want to learn more about the convict leasing system or modern-day prison labor, I have linked 2 websites that share more about that. A large aspect of this injustice is the crimes black men were charged with that get them into the system. H is arrested for looking at his old sharecropper's boss's daughter, just looking at her. Other men H meets have even more absurd arrests. Timothy, a man on H's chain link, had been arrested outside the house he built after the war. A dog had been howling in a nearby field the whole night long, and Timothy had stepped out to tell the dog to hush up. The next morning, the police had arrested him for causing a disturbance. There was also Solomon, a convict who had been arrested for stealing a nickel. His sentence was 12 years. This contrasts with the crimes of white men, like murder. H believes he was 13 when the Civil War ended. Given Anna's heavy pregnancy in August of 1850, I'm assuming H was born the same year. I do this for a specific reason. So when he became free, around 1865, he would actually be about 14. The day the war ended, H had walked all the way to Alabama and found work as a sharecropper. Now he has been arrested without any family or connections and is once more in chains. His changing freedom, the oppression and injustice that H and all the other black men face, immediately make us care for H. Alongside that, he also has an internal lie. He leans on his own solitude. He was used to being alone, but Alabama had turned H's loneliness into something like a physical presence. He could hold it when he went to bed at night. It was in the handle of his hoe and the puffs of cotton that floated away. He doesn't have a family to bail him out, and he doesn't want to make F, the closest person he knows, face the racism of the police after cheating on her. He feels shame, and he knows there are other ways to pay a fine. The women of those jailed taken to the back room, an implication of performing sexual acts for their freedom. He doesn't want F to deal with that, so he holds on to his solitude, maintaining the lie that best protects her. H's unjust incarceration and his internal solitude makes us care for him, makes him compelling. In the mines, he showcases his strength and skill overcoming the physical challenges. The prisoners are put into pairs and have to fulfill a quota or else they are severely punished. A white convict named Thomas is paired with H, who struggles and eventually collapses under the work. H takes Thomas's shovel and fills both of their quotas, avoiding punishment for both of them, which earns him the title To Shovel H. This story and reputation will follow his life after. H is also faced with internal worries and fears. He focuses on the dangers of the mines, or the prose does, and the many different ways many people can die in the mines, not just from being buried alive. After he helps Thomas, his arms hurt so much that they refuse to move, and then he worries about dying. The other convicts, Josie, who was arrested for not crossing the road when a white woman walked by, and Bull, who was attacked and branded by the KKK, and Thomas, the three of them, help H fulfill his quota, eroding his reliance on solitude. If he was alone, he would not have survived that, but other people helped him. He also wants his life to matter. But what kind of life was this? At least when he was a slave, his master had needed to keep him alive if he wanted to get his money's worth. Now, if H died, they would just lease the next man. A mule was worth more than he was. He now has a goal which he cannot reach, being incarcerated, and the only way to do this is to survive. A daunting obstacle. Because of this, H has a big fear of dying as well, but he doesn't show it. After helping Thomas, Thomas asks H why he's called just H, and we finally get an answer to what happened to Anna. The mystery of Anna and baby H from Kojo's chapter sustains throughout the beginning of the chapter, and by the time we get to the answer, so much work has been done to make us care for H. Gyasi did not rely on the connection from Kojo to make us care for H, which is an even bigger feat. And even then, the answer is just a paragraph. My old master says H is what my mama used to call me. They asked her to name me something proper before she gave birth, but she refused. She killed herself. Master said they had to slice me out of her belly before she died. H never met Anna. He doesn't even know her name, as far as I can tell. He doesn't know Kojo. It might not be immediately clear, but an immediate loss has occurred here. I'll touch on this later. After H is released from prison in 1889, he goes to a bar that has black people in it, and he starts to flirt with a woman there, asking where he is. She begins to reciprocate until another man reveals H's scars on his back, revealing him to be a former slave and a former convict. This reinforces his solitude. H moves to Pratt City, where he reunites with Josie, who ended his incarceration years prior. Josie's wife tries to get H to contact F, but he maintains his solitude, still believing in this lie. Josie helps him find work in the mines, the only thing H knows how to do that can earn him a living. It's silently tragic. Actually, well, it's not silent because they say it, but it's very tragic that H has to return to the mines. He remembered what little he had saved sharecropping for 2 years at the Hobbs plantation, and he knew that in some dark and twisted way, the mine was one of the best things that had happened to him. It had taught him a new skill, a worthy one, and his hands would never have to pick cotton or till land ever again. H builds his own home and joins the Union of Miners, his To Shovel H label, following him there and earning him respect from the other miners. A story of the past affecting him in the present. A union doctor had argued that they need to reduce hours, because of the threat of black lung disease, which H dismissed, but the doctor had said that lives were worth fighting for too. H sees the goals that they are trying to accomplish and sees the power of collective action, and this begins to undo his solitude. He begins to question his lie. What if H hadn't been so arrogant when he was a younger man? What if he hadn't been arrested? What if he treated his woman right? He should have had children of his own by now. He should have had a small farm and a full life. H's worries and fears manifest in a scary moment. Suddenly, H felt like he couldn't breathe, like that decade's worth of dust was climbing up his lungs and into his throat and choking him. H makes a decision, overcomes his lie, and has Josie's son, little Joe, who can read and write, send a letter to Eth. He also helps the Union strike. He lets go of the solitude he held on to help the miners bargain, and after 6 months, with the only death being a young boy who had accidentally incited a riot, the miners get increased pay and better hours. At the end of the chapter, H is awarded by having Eth appear in his house. She tells him the ways he disrespected her, how his isolation hurt her, and challenges him, giving him an opportunity to either regress into his lie or overcome it. When H hugs Eth, she doesn't immediately return it, but his embrace shows how much he's changed, fulfilling his storyline. Now, onto that loss I mentioned prior regarding H's birth. Like I said, Abena is the last chapter before part 2, and H's is the first. This splits the chapters evenly with 7 on each side, but I believe the split is even deeper than that. It may be marking the end of slavery within the United States at the conclusion of Civil War in 1865, but that occurs before Abena's story. Besides cutting the chapters equally, I believe there is a part 1 and part 2 to mark how far the family tree can be remembered in the characters' minds. Part 1 begins with Effia, part 2 begins with H. After Abena's chapter, her lineage continues, still with the knowledge of Effia. This is also exemplified by the continuation of Effia's necklace. However, after Kojo's chapter, Anna dies before H is born. Chapter 2 is the farthest back anybody in Esi's lineage can remember, as H has absolutely no knowledge of his family beyond just Anna. His lineage will remember him but cannot trace back any further. Part 2 marks where Esi, Ness, and Kojo, all of their struggles and joys and stories, all of their history, are completely lost. Sure, Kojo still has 7 other children besides H, but we will never get to learn how far the lineage gets. They may remember at least Ness, but after H, all of the history we got is gone. Throughout the entire book, up to this point, the importance of inheritance, story and myth, and lineage is emphasized and returned to. How the myth of Effia's fire curse threatened her lineage, but she overcame it and had Quey, who was too weak to do anything with his life. But then legacy was thrust upon him, which led James to inherit a responsibility he didn't want, so he turned away from it to become a farmer and had Abena, who felt like she had inherited his bad luck and left her village, pregnant and continuing her lineage. How the story of Esi's mother led Esi to be captured and enslaved, who had told her daughter Ness the story/myth of a little dove who cursed them, who then sang the Twi song that helped her son Kojo live as a freeman, who had 7 children, each named after a letter of the alphabet to continue his lineage, but was not able to share the story of his family to baby H, who inherits nothing. Through no cause of their own, half of this history is lost to the characters. And it's painful, and it's sad. And I think that's why there's 2 parts, a demarking of how far the characters' histories can be tracked and remembered. Part 1, Effia. Part 2, H. A summary of Akua's story. Abena's daughter, Akua Collins, has her chapters split between 2 different times. Through brief moments, we learn of her growing up in a Christian missionary school in Kumasi, being raised by the missionary after Abena died a year after Akua's birth. In 1895, the missionary attempts to stop Akua from marrying her husband, telling her how he had accidentally drowned Abena in an attempt to baptize her and had burned all of her things. In 1900, Akua lives in Idweso with her husband Asamoah Akikum and her 2 young daughters, Abena, Abby, and Ama Serwa. She constantly dreams of fire, having recently witnessed a white man being burned alive by her village. Akua's dreaming doesn't help her rest, but she and her mother-in-law, Nana Serwa, have to prepare to support Asamoah, who joins in the Fifth Anglo-Asante War. While he's away, Akua suffers a mental break, and Nana Serwa traps her inside her home, where her dreams of a firewoman grow increasingly disturbing. She's freed from her home when Asamoah returns, the war lost, and one of his legs gone. Now dubbed Crazy Woman and Crippled Man, they try to piece together their family as her son, Yaa, is born. Akua's dream of a firewoman returns, and she wakes up one night being tied to a tree by the villagers trying to burn her alive. Asamoah stops them, and Akua learns that she had set their home on fire. Asamoah had managed to save Yaa, but Abi and Awa were killed. Akua's chapter is probably one of the most interesting chapters to me because it dips its feet into some genre conventions, focusing on the firewoman dreams that Akua has. To me, seeing how she deals with this strange curse, these dreams, is what makes her compelling, as no other character prior deals with something close to fantasy or magic. There are some other things surrounding Akua that I want to cover before, though. Her time with the missionary is tense, as he constantly talks down to her and tells her she's a heathen, as well as caring for her and promising to help her. The missionary sections seem to be a critique on Christianity in Ghana, as his hypocrisy and psychosexual power dynamics with Akua are, well, bad. But they don't really go anywhere. Akua learns about Christianity and its God, but she frequently talks with the fetish priest of Kumasi, and he becomes her only friend when she's living there. And he tells her about the Gold Coast religions and beliefs. This undoes the brainwashing that the missionary tries to do on Akua, and she also breaks away from the brainwashing as well. She was 16 and the fetish priest had died only a year before. She used to go to him whenever she could get away from the missionary. She used to tell him that the more she learned about God from the missionary, the more questions she had. Whenever she asked the missionary these questions, he refused to answer her. The fetish man told her that maybe the Christian God was a question, a great and swirling circle of whys. The missionary had killed Abena accidentally when she resisted being baptized, and he tells Akua he burned all of her mother's stuff. It's not mentioned at all, but we imply that that includes Effia's necklace. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. But Akua sees right through his confession as he pleads for forgiveness from God, specifically. Not from her, from God. These past moments dispensed throughout the narrative of Akua's story just illustrate her connection, or lack thereof, to the religion that her mother had turned to for help and had ultimately killed her. It does seem like there was a lot built up to having Abena go to the missionary for like a specific reason, but then having Abena die the year after she gets there doesn't push any sort of idea forward beyond just hypocrisy and also bad guy. The fetish piece talks about the structural issues with Christianity in Ghana, but the missionary whole deal is a more personal thing, and they both don't really coincide with each other. It doesn't go anywhere, but I don't need it to go anywhere because I already know a lot about critiques of Christianity and stuff. Akua married Asamoah 5 years prior in 1895 and moved from Kumasi to Edweso. Asamoah and other men within Edweso leave for the fifth and last Anglo-Asante War led by Yaa Asantewa. This would be called the War of the Golden Stool, fought in 1900 as the current governor of the colony, Frederick Hodgson, wanted to sit on the artifact and then give it to his queen. This is a obvious insult, and they go to war for it. Asamoah returns from the war missing a leg, and the British end up winning, leading to full British control of the Gold Coast, becoming a colony, or full colony. Okay, now Akua's dreams. There's been a small thread of dreams being memories of the past, or premonitions. And we've seen it with Beula, Kojo's second daughter, having a nightmare. But more prominently, we've seen it with Ness dreaming about Sam, Kojo, and Hell. Here, however, Akua's dreams become more abstract, more genre. And as we continue with the chapters, different descendants will have premonitions, dreams, or visions about past or future events, which affect them like the stories and myths I've mentioned before. And so as we keep moving forward, the characters will be less affected by true stories and myths and more become affected by these ideas, premonitions, visions of stories. Akua's dreams of fire started when she was only 16, right before she had left Kumasi, but they grow into the firewoman dreams when she saw a man being burned alive. A white man had wandered into Edweso and stopped to rest under a tree, and a young child named Kofi Poku pointed a finger and shouted Obroni at him. The fetish man would tell Akua that it derived from Abroni, Wicked One, calling back to Abena learning the term, Obroni from Abroni. A crowd formed and, filled with the anger of the Anglo-Asante Wars, tied him to the tree and set the tree on fire, burning him alive. He pleaded in English that he was not from the government and he was just traveling, but Akua and the other people who knew English did not try to help him. When she came to Edweso and saw and heard a white man being swallowed alive by fire, she dusted off her knees, knelt down, and gave this image and sound to God, but God had refused to keep them. After this, Akua had a nightmare of a fire that raged from Fantaland into Asanteland. Sound familiar? From the get-go, when the firewoman is described as carrying two little girls who disappeared, making the firewoman's sadness burn the trees around her, it's very evident that this is both a memory of Kabeachi's fire and a vision of Mame's grief. Even more than a vision, it is Mame's grief. Kobe had said the fire would haunt his family, and here it is coming back. Because of her dreams, Akua had trouble sleeping. She would wake up screaming or simply not sleep at all. Asamoah isn't trying to help her, too focused on the war, and Akua's mental state is affected. And the first manifestation of this is in her focus on her hearing, feeling like she can hear more than usual. She would zone out listening, and Nana Iserwa, Asamoah's mother, would snap at her. She wasn't just staring into space, she was listening to all the sounds the world had to offer, to all the people who inhabited these spaces the others could not see. Her idleness made her unpopular with Nana Serwa. The dreams worsen as Asamoah leaves and the war begins. Akua, Nana Serwa, and the other women in the Edweso prepare food to send away, working for long hours. That, combined with Akua not sleeping well, makes her waking hours harder to deal with. In her dreams, the firewoman seems familiar to her, raging against the loss of her daughters. She looked familiar, and Akua wanted to ask questions. She wanted to know if the firewoman knew the white man who had been burned, if everyone touched by fire was a part of the same world, if she was being called. Instead, Akua just wakes up screaming. Her mental state worsens, and while newly pregnant, there's a moment where she becomes enthralled by the fire under a pot, stuck within a stupor. This continues happening with different fires. This trance state continues, and Nana Serwa decides to send Akua into her hut, essentially exiling her. She places Fat Man, a man too big to fight in the war, in front of her door so she can't get out, and that's his war that he's fighting. In the hut, the firewoman's dreams get more specific. She begins to talk to her. She asks her where Akua's children are, and tells her she must always know where her children are at all times. This makes Akua afraid. Nana won't let her see her daughters, and Akua suffers a mental break. She prays all day to every god she knows about. Prayer was not a sacred or holy thing. It was not spoken plainly in Twi or English. It need not be performed on the knees or with folded palms. For Akua, prayer was a frenzied chant, a language for those desires of the heart that even the mind did not recognize were there. It was a scraping up the clay floor into her dark palms. It was a crouching in the shadow of the room. It was a one-syllable word that escaped her lips over and over and over again. Fire, fire, fire. Akua becomes catatonic, and only when Asamoah returns is she finally freed. After her mental episode and Asamoah's amputation, others in the village would call them crazy woman and crippled man. Akua doesn't care and latches onto her daughters, never letting them or Asamoah leave her sight willingly. It takes a bit for normalcy to return to them, a tense moment where the war and dreams had affected husband and wife so much that it was uncertain if they were to return to the normal. After having sex for the first time since his return, Akua doesn't dream of fire again. Yaw is born, and it looks like they can continue with their family. Akua begins to rebuild her family, and they are happy once more, and the conflicts of the past have left. Asamoah, the children, and Akua head into bed one night, a prolonged night of food, love, and then sleep. Without knowing the future, this would almost seem perfect. But Akua dreams. This is the page that I will read for this video. Now, flat backed into their hut, Akua allows herself to close her eyes. She imagined as she was lying in the sand of the beaches of Cape Coast. Sleep came for her like waves, first licking her curling toes, her swollen feet, her aching ankles. By the time it hit her mouth, nose, and eyes, she was no longer afraid of it. When she entered the dreamland, she was on the same beach. She had been there only once, with the missionaries from the school. They had wanted to start a new school in a nearby village, but found the townspeople unwelcoming. Akua had been mesmerized by the color of the water. It was a color she had never had a word for because nothing like it appeared in her world. No tree green, no sky blue, no stone or yam or clay would capture it. In dreamland, Akua walked to the edge of the rolling ocean. She dipped her toe into water so cool she felt she could taste it, like a breeze hitting the back of the throat. Then the breeze turned hot as the ocean caught fire. The breeze from the back of Akua's throat began to swirl round and round, gathering speed until it could no longer be contained within Akua's mouth, and so she shot it out. And the spit-out breeze began to move the fiery ocean, dipping down into the depths to collect itself until a spiraling wind in fiery ocean became the woman that Akua now felt she knew so well. This time the fire woman was not angry. She beckoned Akua onto the ocean, and though afraid, Akua took her first step. Her feet burned. When she lifted one up, she could smell her own flesh wafting from the bottom. Still, she moved, following the firewoman until she led her to a place that looked like Akua's own hut. Now in the firewoman's arms were two fire children she had held in the first time Akua dreamed of her. They were locked into each arm, head resting on either breast. Their cries were soundless, but Akua could see the sound floating out of their mouths like puffs of smoke from the fetish man's favorite pipe. Akua had the urge to hold them, and she reached out her hands to them. Her hands caught fire, but she touched them still. Soon she cradled them with her own burning hands, played with the braids of rope of fire that made up their hair, their coal-black lips. She felt calm, happy even, that the firewoman had found her children again at last. And as she held them, the firewoman did not protest. She did not try to snatch them away. Instead, she watched, crying from joy. And her tears were the color of the ocean in Fantaland, that not green, not blue color that Akua remembered from her youth. The color began to gather, blue and more blue, green and more green, until a torrent of tears began to put out the fire in Akua's hands, until the children began to disappear. Powerful imagery, powerful stuff. As I said before, Akua wakes when the locals tie her to a tree, trying to burn her alive. When Asamoah saves her and takes her back to the house, she's still confused. Nana Sarawak and the doctors were tending to Yaw's wounds. The baby was screaming, the sound seeming to come from somewhere outside of himself. They would not tell her where they put Abby and Nama Sarawak. They would not say anything at all. Akua's chapter dips into genre conventions, dealing with a fantastic or magical dream of her ancestor, Mame, raging for the loss of her daughters, Effia and Esi. The dream made Akua give her two young daughters to the firewoman to soothe her anger and sadness. An unexpected tragedy, one that calls back to the fire that began with Effia's chapter. And I absolutely adore this chapter for that. A summary of Willie's story. In the 1920s, H's daughter, Willie Black, tries to sing in her church, unable to make a sound. She walks through Harlem with her son, Carson, and reminisces of how she came to live here. Willie would sing in the union meetings H led, which is where she meets Robert Clifton. They connect and eventually get married at 18 and have Carson at 20. Willie and Robert joined the Great Migration and moved to Harlem right as the Harlem Renaissance begins. They struggle with getting a job as Robert is white passing, and having a black wife gets him denied from work. Robert struggles with finding a job that fulfills him, while Willie struggles to find any job. After finally securing themselves jobs, they grow apart as Willie grows frustrated with Robert's weaknesses. While cleaning a bathroom of the jazz club she works at, Robert and his white co-workers bump into her, and the co-workers molest Willie by proxy of Robert. He leaves Willie and Carson, and Willie moves away, and now a single mother, Willie struggles to find a job while also going to singing auditions, but she can no longer sing. She joins a church and meets Eli, a poet. They have a daughter together, Josephine, but Eli comes and goes, not tying himself to Willie. In the present, Willie walks with Carson through Harlem and sees Robert across the street living as a white man with a wife and child. Willie forgives Robert, and they return to church where Willie can sing once again. Willie's story, like James, is very complex. She goes through a lot in her chapter and in the future chapters, and the biggest source of conflict for Willie is the buildup to making Robert an antagonist, and her trying to deal with the stress that manifests into not being able to sing. Willie's singing is unique to her and helps to be a symbol for internal turmoil. We begin the chapter in her being in church, being told to sing, and not being able to. Another source of conflict in the background that doesn't really get resolved in this chapter is her relationship with her son, Carson. Willie had met Robert in a union. We see the evolution of H's character becoming a union leader, which is very fulfilling. Willie sings at the meeting, feeling pride and happiness with it. Meeting Robert, Willie and her sister Hazel react to his light-skinnedness, being light-skinned. Hazel going as far as saying that Robert having white ancestors is not right, which makes him say that H being so old is not right either. Willie pushes him, defending H, a great indicator of character, and he apologizes. The push had broken some kind of barrier between them, and from the day on, Robert and Willie were as close as any two people could be. They marry and have Carson a few years later. H and F die the same year Carson is born, around 1920, which saddens Willie. Now, Willie doesn't have anything tying her to Pratt City besides Hazel, and she and Robert want to move away. The beginning of Robert's descent into antagonism is when he dismisses his current job, saying it doesn't have any honor in it like mining does, like what H did. Willie knows that Robert would never survive the mines. H barely survived, and we get this really interesting view into H's health as a result of the mines. Her father had stopped working in the mines years and years before he died, yet still he almost never stopped coughing, and sometimes when he coughed, a string of black mucus would escape his mouth, his face would contort, and his eyes bulge out, so it looked to Willie as though some invisible man were behind him, hands wrapped around the large trunk of his thick neck, choking him. Willie knows that Robert could not handle hands around his neck. Willie saw how much her father suffered from the mines, despite the good it did for their livelihoods, and Robert keeps saying how much honor working the mines gives, seems to cast H's own suffering in a strange, wrong light, as if it was all justified. But Willie saw how much H hurt years after the mine. Robert putting mining on this pedestal dismisses H's pain, which subconsciously grates at Willie. There's an interesting moment occurs when they are trying to decide where to go. New York, Willie said, just as soon as she had thought it. Harlem. The word hit her like a memory. Though she had never been there, she could sense its presence in her life, a premonition, a forward memory. Like I mentioned in Akua's chapter, more descendants begin to have premonitions or omens, and Willie's sends them straight to the Harlem Renaissance, which was an intellectual and cultural revival of African American art and music within Harlem, Manhattan, from the 1920s to 1930s. Once they moved, staying with Josie's son, Joe Turner, he was Little John. Little Joe? It was Little Joe, and now he goes by Joe Turner. Willie and Robert try to get jobs. Willie wants to audition for singing performances, and Robert subtly tells her to focus on him getting a job first, saying he's the man of the relationship. They walk together to find jobs, but when the store owners see that Robert, who could pass for white, is married to Willie, visibly black, they reject him. This causes a rift in their relationship. They return without a word to Josie's apartment, and Willie stays with Carson while Robert leaves again, trying to find a job. Alone with Carson, Willie has another forward memory like before of her loneliness. She knows that Robert's self-conscious and nervous manner will get in the way of their combined goals. Next time they try to find jobs, he walks ahead of her and they don't speak or talk to each other. They don't discuss this, pretending to each other that it's all fine. Robert finds and quickly quits one job when a white man says something racist to Robert about a black woman customer. And Robert had come home that night crying to Willie that it could have been her the man was talking about, and so he'd quit. This explanation seems weak. Robert seems weak. Willie ends up getting two jobs, one taking care of a child in the morning, and the other cleaning a jazz club at night, leading to Carson being cared for by someone else in the building. She's not able to sing in the jazz club as she's too dark, and Willie's own ego begins to flare. If she were Robert, Willie thought, Robert could have any job he wanted, but she knew he was too scared to try. Robert has stayed the same timid boy Willie had met when younger, but has not toughened up to deal with the real world. To Willie, she could make use of the privilege he has to be able to pass as white in a world that looks down at her dark skin. If she was lighter, she'd be able to sing at the jazz club like she wants to. Learning that Willie got a second job, Robert tells her that they don't need it, but Willie knows that they don't have enough money to survive only on Robert's circumstantial job. His weakness and his need to be the breadwinner clash with each other, making it harder for him to succeed. And when he ignores this flaw, Willie and Carson are affected. They need money to survive. Robert puts this idea of honor above all else for him, and his inability to reach the standards he made for himself makes him reject reality, sinking deeper into his own lies and into antagonism. His rejection of reality hurts Willie, who has to face reality head on every day. Their relationship falters as he spends some nights away and never tells her what he's doing, and she never shares with him her current job at the jazz club. Willie would crawl into bed next to Carson and wait, wide-eyed, for the sound of Robert's boots coming down the hall, the clop, clop, clop. That meant she would have her husband for the night. If she did hear it, if he did come, she would close her eyes quickly, and the two of them would play the game of make-believe, acting like the people on stage at the club did. Robert's role was to slip in quietly beside her, and hers was not to question, to let him believe that she still believed in him, in them. This souring of Willie's relationships and her stalwart facing of reality really endears us to her as we watch her survive, or try to survive. Her relationship with her son is also on the rocks. The other day, when Willie had picked Carson up from Bess's apartment to take him to Joe's, she'd heard her son call the old woman Mama, and a terrible, immovable lump formed in her throat as she clutched him to her body and took him up the stairs. The decision she has to do to make sure they have a house to live in and food to eat also causes sacrifices, less time to raise her son. We also see moments of Carson when he's like a toddler or young child being very angry all the time, almost hating Willie. The last nail in Willie and Robert's relationship is when they bump into each other at the jazz club. Willie is surprised, not at seeing him, but at not having recognized his back as he tried vomiting in the sink, thinking he was just a white patron. It was a matter of knowing the things that he could not yet let himself know, like that he was not the kind of man who could handle invisible hands around his neck. Like Carson's birth had changed him, but not for the better. It made him deeply afraid of himself, always questioning his choices, never measuring up to a standard of his own making. That Willie could recognize these things in Robert, but be unable to recognize his hunched back, his hanging head, frightened her. Two white coworkers come in and begin to harass Willie, and before she defends herself, Robert interrupts, telling her Willie don't, which clues into the coworkers that they are married, or at least together. Robert is afraid of losing his job, which constrains Willie. The coworkers make Robert kiss and touch Willie, basically molesting her by proxy, and Robert does it, afraid of losing his job. And once the two nameless men are satisfied, they leave and fire Robert. He would have lost his job from the beginning, yet his inability to stand up for himself and Willie hurts Willie. The only sensible thing Robert does then is to tell Willie he's leaving, as she had already decided he would. Now a single mother, Willie moves away from Josie's and tries to live on her own means. Her struggles trying to work while raising a young child makes us sympathize with her. She would try to audition, but ever since Robert's violation, she had not been able to sing, some unknown internal obstacle for her and the audience that we hope she overcomes. Willie joins a church choir where she meets Eli. Willie and Akua, as a pair, deal with Christianity the most, and while Akua's is diving into it and undoing Christianity, Willie's is a commitment of necessity, turning to it for a salve and an order for her disorganized world. Here, her religion isn't framed as a negative, as it is in Akua's chapter, only as a neutral good. Meeting Eli and having Josephine adds to Willie's struggles, as now she has to deal with two young children while Eli flakes, leaving whenever he wants, not helping Willie pay for rent or food. Eli calls Carson Sonny, as Robert did. I didn't mention that before. Robert will call Carson Sonny. And Willie hates that Eli calls him Sonny as well, but Carson insists, driving further wedges between Willie's relationships. At the end of her chapter, 3 quick moments build into an amazing conclusion for Willie. We return to Willie walking with Carson through Harlem after leaving church. All of Willie's past has been laid before us, and we've learned of her frustration, struggles, and inability to sing. The first moment is when she and Carson begin walking through a predominantly white neighborhood. She suddenly sees Robert across the street with a new wife and new child. Willie smiled at Robert, and it wasn't until that smile that she realized she forgave him. She felt like that smile had opened a valve, like the pressure of anger and sadness and confusion and loss was shooting out of her into the sky and away, away. Her past frustrations reach a conclusion as she reaches closure regarding her antagonist, Robert. The second moment is back in the church. Eli has a book ready to be published, and he stayed with Willie for longer than usual. And he holds Josephine on his lap and sits next to Carson in the pews while they are performing. The pastor talks about putting down his cross and not picking it up again, which gets Willie thinking about H. She thought about H coming home every night from the mines with his pickaxe and his shovel. He would put them down on the porch and take his boots off before coming in. He used to say the best part of his day was when he could put that shovel down and walk inside to see his girls waiting for him. Willie reflects on H, the man who shaped her, and draws a parallel to Jesus, the cross and the pickaxe, the same weight on their shoulders. It's as if she's remembering how H lived, struggling under the weight and with hands around his neck, and still faces the world with love. And she starts shaking. The third moment is right after this. She trembles with emotion, joy, and sadness. There's a moment of silence within the song the choir sings, and when all of a sudden she drops her songbook. A loud thud reverberates around the room, and everyone turns to her with surprise. All eyes on Willie, confused and silent. With the suddenness of the moment, she has no time to dwell on the pressure inside of her and the struggles she faces, and like a floodgate opening, Willie steps forward and sings once more. An amazing climax to the complex and thorough chapter of Willie, a triumphant success as she sings once more, fulfilling her desire that she had lost after all she went through. Amazing ending to Willie's chapter. A summary of Yaw's chapter. In 1949, Akua's son, Yaa Gyasi, teaches at a school in Takadori as a history teacher. He has lunch with a teacher friend, Edward Bowen, whose wife tries to help Yaw get a wife of his own. He focuses instead on Ghanaian independence, trying to write a book to inspire others to push for independence. In school, he uses his burn scars to teach about history and how all they learn is flawed because they can't get first-hand knowledge. Yaw knows about Akua's mental break that burned his face, but left Edweso when he was very young, so he doesn't have a relationship with his mother. When Edward's wife gets pregnant, Yaw can't eat with them anymore, so he gets a house girl to cook and clean for him, which he was resistant about because he struggles with being perceived outside of teaching, which is a performance for him. He hires Esther Amoa, who talks quickly and helps Yaw step out of his comfort zone, trying to get him to reconnect with his mother. After 5 years, Yaw has fallen in love with Esther and is convinced to visit Edweso to see her. He and Esther visit Akua, who keeps odd hours and doesn't sleep. She tells him that she had returned to the missionary after the fire, looking for answers, and he revealed that the only thing he didn't burn from Abena was Effia's necklace, which Akua gives to Yaw now. He tells him of their history, which fills Yaw with anger and sadness as she apologizes for burning his face and changing his life. Yaw's chapter deals with the upcoming Ghanaian independence that won't arrive until 1957, and Yaw focuses on his external conflict to avoid dealing with his internal conflict, this interplay making him very interesting. When the progress towards independence stalls, Yaw begins to grow angry and sad, which is where we get to see Yaw as an interesting character. When he talks with Edward, his rhetoric regarding Ghanaian independence reveals that he wants to help lead their country to freedom, to lead the revolution, but the means for him to do so are limited by his age, close to 50 years old. He focuses on his book, which he's titled Let the Africans Own Africa. He gets frustrated when the writing gets complicated. We learn more about Ghanaian history here, such as the creation of the Convention People's Party by Kwame Nkrumah in 1949, who would go on to be the country's first president when they eventually become independent, and the leaders of the Gold Coast independence movement, the Big Six, returning from being educated in America and England. I've linked articles talking more about the Big Six if you want to learn more about that. Yaw perceives them as patient but forceful, like his friend Edward, who believes independence, they all believe independence will just arrive eventually. But Yaa wants action now. Yaa had been reading more and more about the Black people of America's movement towards freedom, and he was attracted to the rage that lit each sentence of their books on fire. He wanted that from his book, an academic rage. All he could seem to muster was a long-winded whine. His history lesson is a great presentation of Yaa's views while also hiding who he is. Yaa is badly scarred by Akua's fire, and he uses his scar to teach about history, writing on the board, "History is storytelling." The young boys in his class are told stories by older brothers or cousins about Yaa and his burns, and he asks them to share these rumors about his scars. The boys seem scared and hesitant at first, as it may seem like he's shaming them, but he talks to them with a smile and assures them, hoping to push them to share. He's kind, soft-spoken, and encouraging of them. One boy says he was born of fire, and that's why he's so smart, because he was lit by fire. This is a callback to Effia. Another says that his mother was fighting evil spirits from Asamondo, the land of the spirits. Another says Yaa's father cursed the gods for the Asante lost in the war, and the gods took vengeance. The last child says he did it to himself to have something to talk about in the first day of class, which amuses Yaa. He then asks the class which story is correct, and one boy correctly says that they can't know which story is correct because they were not there, which is exactly the point that Yaa makes. This is the problem in history. We cannot know that which we were not there to see and hear and experience for ourselves. We must rely upon the word of others. Those who were there in the olden days, they told stories to the children so that the children would know, so that the children could tell stories to their children, and so on and so on. We believe in the one who has the power. He is the one who gets to write the story. So when you study history, you must always ask yourself, whose story am I missing? Whose voice was suppressed so that his voice could come forth? Once you have figured that out, you must find that story too. From there, you begin to get a clearer, yet still imperfect picture. Yaa knows how history is built, and he wants to be on the victor's side, which is why he tries so hard to imbue his book with power and rage, to inspire others to be moved and to bring independence to Ghana. He wants to put the anger he has about his scars and his past to good use. His talk about children passing on stories also reflects how these stories of these children keep passing on to each other as well. Yaa doesn't know how he got his scars. There's dramatic irony here, as we, the audience, know, which makes us invested in having Yaa know too. The villagers in Edweso had only recounted the events of the night of Akua's fire to him, and then how Akua and Asamoah were exiled to the edge of the town. The town had collected money and sent Yaa to school at around 5 or 6 years old, and Asamoah had died not long after. Yaa has no connection to Akua. She used to write letters to him, but he never wrote back, so the letter stopped coming. Yaa's childhood was affected by his burning, losing out on relationships. Some women believed that their children would inherit his scar. With the building frustration of his book and his own anger about his past, Yaa has trouble dealing with other people. He sees teaching as a performance and has stayed very isolated outside of it. At home, he was who he really was, shy and lonely, angry and embarrassed. He did not want anyone to see him there. That's why he was so hesitant as well to hire a house girl. He hires Esther as a house girl, and her hesitation around him is not about his scar, as he first thought, but of the language, thinking she had to speak to him in English. She's afraid of being seen as uneducated, and when he lets her speak in Twi, she opens up, bright and shining. Esther treats Yaa as if the scar is a simple aspect of his person, not something to focus on, which moves him. She also talks a mile a minute and is brave enough to push him to walk with her to the market or to reconnect with his mother, taking him out of his comfort zone. Esther also helps him realize why he struggles so much, or at least vocalize it. Esther notes how angry Yaa is, and he agrees. It was something he rarely admitted to himself, let alone to someone else. The longer he looked at himself in the mirror, the longer he lived alone, the longer the country he loved stayed under colonial rule, the angrier he became. And the nebulous, mysterious object of his anger was his mother, a woman whose face he could barely remember, but a face reflected in his own scar. Within 5 years of getting to know Esther, answering every single question she asks, and like when she talks really fast, drawing him out of himself, he falls in love with her. He's saddened by their differences, which makes having a relationship with her, if not impossible, at least difficult. There's less social constraints around it, but still it's a difficult basis for a relationship. In a bid to get her to love him, he relents to her insistence to see Akua again. He's reaching over, he's pushing through his anger and sadness to reach a level of happiness he's denied himself. Their visit to Edweso has him meeting an older Kofi Poku, the same boy that had condemned the white man to death, the Abroni, who's now an adult with children of his own. Kofi Poku's children and his wife at some point stare at Yaw's scars. Esther draws attention to herself, helping Yaw not be under the spotlight so much. They are complementing each other now, complementing. They plan to see Akua in the evening as she has a different schedule, a remnant of her troubled dreams. Esther had been trying to get Yaw to forgive Akua for burning him, but Yaw sees forgiveness as a foreign concept introduced by the white man, a trick from Christianity. Forgiveness was an act done after the fact, a piece of the bad deed's future. But if you point people's eyes to the future, they might not see what is being done to hurt them in the present. Yaw doesn't know what his goal is beyond loving Esther, so he comes to this interaction with an open mind and a hesitant eye. Yaw's meeting with Akua is very emotional, both within the text and for us, the readers. So much of the book is building and building the past of this family and making us care for every single ancestor. Akua's servant woman, Kukua, and Akua herself react with elation and relief that Yaw has visited, thanking God and thanking her dreams, which Akua says told her that he'd come. Akua touches his burn scars, and he sees the scars on her hand and legs as well. Yaw asks her how he got them, and she says that she can't talk about the dreams unless she talks about their family. She recounts the story we know of the firewoman dreams, Abena's death at the hands of the missionary, the white man burned alive, and the fire of the hut. Dramatic irony has been resolved. Then she shares with Yaw information we didn't know. Her dreams had continued, and the firewoman shows Akua different locations. All of our memories of the past book are rewarded with small details in her dreams. The firewoman, Mame, shows Akua the ocean in Cape Coast. Once more, return to this detail, which could mean anyone between Effia, Esi, or Quey. The firewoman shows her a cocoa farm, Abena, and the firewoman shows her Kumasi, James. Akua went back to the missionary in Kumasi to get more answers from him, and he revealed that he didn't burn one of Abena's possessions. When she pulls out Effia's necklace, which had been hidden from us since Unlucky gave it to Abena, it's like an artifact is revealed. 5 generations later, Effia's necklace continues. She had taken the necklace to the fetish man's son after the fact, who dropped the necklace and says there is evil in her lineage. He says that the necklace does not belong to her, it belonged to her ancestor who is visiting Akua, the firewoman. Her ancestor can tell her where Akua came from, and the fetish man says Akua should be glad that she was chosen. The necklace had burned his hand, another connection to fire. The idea of premonitions and visions continues with Akua being chosen by her ancestors. Yaw grows angry at this because her being chosen led to his burns and his exile. She cries and says she can't forgive herself for scarring him. Akua listened to her dreams and learned of the evil in the lineage. There are people who have done wrong because they could not see the result of the wrong. They did not have these burned hands as warning. This calls back to Yaw's view of forgiveness. Akua tells Yaw that evil begets evil, and how easy it is for it to fester unseen. She apologizes for burning him, for casting a shadow over his life that fills him with anger, the shadow over Esther, and the shadow over his children. When someone does wrong, whether it is you or me, whether it is mother or father, whether it is the Gold Coast man or the white man, it is like a fisherman casting a net into the water. He keeps only the 1 or 2 fish that he needs to feed himself and puts the rest into the water, thinking that their lives will go back to normal. No one forgets that they were once captive, even if they are free now. But still, Yaw, you have to let yourself be free. This evil that Akua mentions is the slavery their family promoted. Effia marrying a slaver, Quey becoming a slaver, that which affected their relatives, Quey Ness, Kojo, and H, which makes life harder for Willie. James's turning away from slavery doesn't help anybody, and Abena's ignorance of the world, thanks to him, leads to Akua's suffering the dreams, which leads to Yaw's burns. But they are all victims of each other and of history. The colonialism in Africa, the scar of slavery on the world. Yaw reaches closure here, and he, Esther, Akua, and Kukua, her house servant, eat all night. A beautiful ending that sets up major changes in the future. A summary of Sonny's chapter. In 1957, Willie's son, Carson Sonny Clifton, is bailed out of jail by Willie, who works cleaning houses on the Upper East Side. Sonny's frustrated with the failure of Black liberation in the time, working for the NAACP, marching in protest, and getting arrested. He is also the father of 3 daughters to 3 different women and does not want to be their father. After an encounter with a boy in poverty, Sonny contemplates drugs to help weather his pain, but decides against it. He quits working for the NAACP, unable to deal with the pain he sees so close to home, and gets a job as a bartender. He meets a 19-year-old singer, Amani Zulema, and he becomes infatuated with her, being almost twice her age. Her singing reminds him of Willie's, and he finds her at a different bar, declaring his want for her. She takes him to a drug den, showing how she's a drug addict. The chapter jumps forward almost 8 years, and Sonny is deep in his heroin addiction at 45 years old, staying at another junkie's house. Willie tries to find him, but he avoids seeing her. Amani convinces Sonny to go to Sunday dinner with Willie in the hope she'll give them money for drugs, and at Willie's place he sees his half-sister Josephine, with children of her own, worried that he'll hurt Willie. Josephine leaves with the kids, and Willie tells Sonny about Robert. Josephine leaves with the kids, and Willie tells Sonny about Robert, his father, which she had refused to talk about before. She tells Sonny how white people have controlled black people, with drugs being the latest development. Sonny's anger about the Black freedom movement returns to him and helps Sonny break through his addiction, deciding to stay with Willie and trying to get clean. Sonny's chapter is difficult to go through because it is a degradation of character. We have already experienced a younger Carson, who only goes by Sonny now, and saw his disquiet and anger in Willie's chapter, which primes him to be going through a character arc, slowly regressing towards heroin addiction. Similar to Yaa, Sonny has a troubled relationship with his mother as well, but this time their relationship is explored in close proximity. Willie, who we see now cleans houses regularly, arrives to bail Sonny out of jail after being arrested at a protest. Also similar to Yaa, who looked at the African American liberation movement for inspiration, Sonny looks to writing centering around returning to Africa to inspire his liberation goals. Liberia and Sierra Leone are signaled out by Sonny, who wants to avoid white people altogether. Their relationship is very strained. Willie is disappointed in Sonny's arrest, and he is disappointed in her withholding of information about Robert. She never told him about his father, and that has led to an internal discontent that makes Sonny be an absent father of his own children. Sonny's anger about not knowing who his father is and anything about him has become a constant feeling, and his disillusionment with Black liberation grates at him further. He works for the NAACP and frequently meets Black families living in poverty and in horrible living conditions, and he has no power to help them. These conditions he and Willie used to or still live in. Other events are mentioned that he dwells on that show the current time. Reverend George Lee from Mississippi dies from a gunshot while he was trying to register to vote, and Rosa Jordan, who was pregnant, was shot while riding a desegregated bus, ultimately surviving, both events happening in late 1956. All of these events begin to wear down on Sonny, skipping work to avoid seeing anybody and avoid seeing this pain. He asks a man he's friendly with but doesn't know his name what someone does when they feel helpless, and the man suggests alcohol and drugs, giving Sonny a small glassine bag, I believe to be heroin, might be something else, but most likely heroin. Sonny's helplessness keeps growing, and when we see him contemplate this small bag of drugs, we begin to fear that he'll start taking drugs, and we hope he doesn't. Sonny does fortunately throw the bag down the drain, removing the temptation, but we now understand how susceptible Sonny has become to means of escape. Sonny quits his job with the NAACP, further reducing any connection he has with anybody, and gets a job as a bartender where he meets Amani Zulema, who performs at the bar. Sonny is enraptured with her singing as it reminds him of Willie's singing. He remembers the exact ending scene of Willie's chapter and reflects on the joy she had. It was the most beautiful thing Sonny had ever heard, and he loved his mother then like he had never loved her before. The congregation said, "Sing, Willie," and "Amen," and "Bless God," and it seemed to Willie then that his mother didn't have to wait for heaven for her reward. He could see it. She was already wearing her crown. She was singing, "I Will Wear a Crown." I don't know that song. Despite the further mentions of Willie's struggles with housing, raising her children, and the absent Eli, we see that Willie's conclusion carries over and does affect Sonny in some way. Sonny feels the same emotions now watching Amani as when he watched Willie. When Sonny pursues Amani, they discuss the back to Africa business, the impulse of some African Americans to return to Africa to avoid oppression. Amani shares the opinion that doing so would not accomplish what was promised. We can't go back to something we ain't never been to in the first place. It ain't ours anymore. This is. She swept her hand in front of her as though she was trying to catch all of Harlem in it, all of New York, all of America. Sonny expresses his want of Amani, and she challenges him, showing how she's a drug addict, and takes him to a dope house. He watches her shoot up, and she asks if he still wants her. We've seen prior how susceptible Sonny is, and his desire to escape realities of his world, having cut off most connections and straining his familiar relationships. He avoids reality like Robert did. Sonny here is poised on the edge of a cliff, a decision whether to pursue his want of Amani or turn away. And we want him to avoid temptation. We want him to not become an addict like her. The question is left in the air as the story transitions to a parallel scene to the beginning of the chapter, with Willie trying to get Sonny out of the dope house. This time, though, she fails and leaves, further showing how deep Sonny has gotten into his addiction. The focus of the prose here shifts. He sat quietly, or at least what he thought was quietly. He was sweating, his chest heaving up and down, up and down. He would need to go score soon to keep himself from dying. Sonny's narration is more focused on the physical, the present, and future actions, which contrasts his prose before his addiction, where he was focused on the internal, the past, and his current issues. This contrast shows how pathetic Sonny has become after his addiction, now so focused on one singular thing that he can't think of anything else. Harlem and heroin. Heroin and Harlem. Sonny could no longer think of one without thinking of the other. They sounded alike. Both were going to kill him. The junkies and jazz had gone together, fed each other, and now every time Sonny heard a horn, he wanted a hit. This degradation of character is very disappointing to see, as we see him turn from temptation before, but we know that it was his want for Amani that led him here. It's even worse when we see his contempt and disregard for her even now. Sonny had never loved her, not really, but he had always wanted her. It took him a while to learn the differences between these two things. He recognizes now his mistake about her, but is too much in the thrall of addiction to leave. Amani can't sing anymore, unable to perform at the same bars she used to frequent, now so full in her addiction as well. This sort of reflects Willie's inability to perform and seems to comment on how Willie's inability was from an internal block, while Amani and Sonny, by extension, are both blocked by drugs themselves, external to them. At Willie's Sunday dinner, a really sad moment occurs. Willie tells Josephine, Sonny's sister, to take the kids out for some ice cream, and Josephine gives Willie a look. It was a look that asked if Willie would be safe left alone with him, and the uncertain nod Willie gave back just about broke Sonny's heart. This further details how far Sonny has dropped, and it's devastating to experience from Sonny's perspective, as we, the audience, have come to care for Willie since her chapter. At the end of the chapter, Sonny goes to Willie's Sunday dinner in the hopes she'll give him money for drugs. Sonny and Willie's conversation mirrors Yaw and Akua's conversation, both revealing information to the chapter character that the audience knew, dramatic irony, along with further advice and breakthroughs that we didn't know. She tells him about Robert, recalling the scene we experienced prior, seeing him across the street. Sonny grows angry and accuses Willie of letting people walk all over her and for not fighting for anything. Instead of responding with anger, she touches his shoulder and she tells him she fought for him by giving up her dream of becoming a famous singer, by moving to Harlem, and by wanting a better world for Sonny. She only calls him Carson, recalling her dislike of calling him Sonny, as Robert did. Willie says that Robert could choose his life, alluding to her frustration with him prior, but Sonny was never able to choose his life from birth being visibly black, which she predicts is what made Sonny so angry as a child. Willie tells him about choice and how white men get a choice. White men get to choose for black men too. Used to sell them, now they just send them to prison like they did my daddy, so they can't be with their kids. Just about breaks my heart to see you, my son, my daddy's grandson, over here with these babies walking up and down Harlem who barely even know your name, let alone your face. These are things you ain't learned from me, things you picked up from your father even though you ain't known him, things he picked up from white men. Again, the idea of inheritance of a concept. Willie shows Sonny how he's falling into the same patterns Robert went through and how white men have controlled Sonny without him knowing. This kicks Sonny to remember his former wants, his struggles with oppression. She pulls out a wad of cash. And like before, Sonny has to make a decision. Take the money for drugs and leave, or stay and try to get clean. What Sonny wanted was to scream, to take the money, take what was left in the bag in his shoe, and find somewhere to go shoot up until he could no longer remember the things his mother had told him. That is what he wanted to do. But he didn't do that. Instead, he stayed. The interaction between his want, drugs, and his need to be clean creates a conflict that we want to see him succeed, and he does. And it's an amazing moment to see him begin to pull himself out of the degradation narrative that had occurred already, his decision to stay with Willie cementing his improvement. We approach now the final generation of Effia and Esi's lineage. 7 generations of stories, cascading from the late 1700s to the late 1990s and to the turn of the millennia. So much has been built up between descendants, and so much has spilled forward, from fears to worries to wants. It all coalesces in these last 2 chapters. It's getting darker. A summary of Marjorie's chapter. In summer of 1982, Yaw's daughter, Marjorie Marcus, visits her grandmother Akua in Ghana, who's moved to Cape Coast. They walk along the coast as Akua reminds Marjorie to wear Effia's stone given to her a year ago, and she reflects on the story of her ancestors that Akua shared. After summer passes, Marjorie returns home to Huntsville, Alabama, where her parents moved before she was born. She struggles with her Ghanaian roots while also going to school, not able to connect to Ghana or America. For 3 years, Marjorie voraciously reads, and at the library she meets Graham, a German-born student, and they begin a tentative relationship reading together. Marjorie's teacher, Mrs. Pinkston, sets up a Black cultural event for the school and invites Marjorie to write and share a poem. She struggles to write it while navigating her relationship with Graham. She soon learns that Akua has grown sick, and she promises to visit her next summer. Her anxiety about Akua makes her hesitant about Graham, and as the prom approaches, he calls to tell her that he can't take her because his father would disapprove. At the Black cultural event, Marjorie shares a poem inspired by the stories of her ancestor Akua shared with her, and then learns that Akua has passed away. She and her parents go to Ghana for her funeral, and Marjorie cries from her loss. Marjorie's chapter caps the end of Effia's lineage, and both rewards the audience for paying attention and investing in the characters, as well as accomplishing Effia's goal from the end of her chapter. Granted, there is a definite answer just in the continuation of her lineage in general, but as Marjorie grows up learning about her family, we see that Baba's curse didn't work. Something did come from nothing. Marjorie visits Akua in Ghana, who has moved to the Cape Coast to be close to the ocean, once more bringing in the visual of the water. She's no longer called Crazy Woman. The locals now just call her Old Lady, and they say that she can recite the entire history of Ghana from memory. Akua makes sure Marjorie speaks Twi, ironic because Marjorie had only spoken Twi when she was younger until a teacher misunderstood her, thinking that she did not know English, so Yaw and Esther had Marjorie respond to them in English only. They spoke Twi, she responded in English. It becomes the first language she thinks of when she's speaking, and now has to switch back into Twi for Akua. Pretty early on, we see that Yaw has given Marjorie Effia's necklace and has shared its past. Her father had given it to her only a year before, saying that she was finally old enough to care for it. It had belonged to Old Lady and to Abena before her, and to James and Quey and Effia the Beautiful before. It had begun with Mame, the woman who had set a great fire. Her father had told her that the necklace was part of their family history, and she was never to take it off, never to give it away. Now it reflected the ocean water before them, gold waves shimmering in the black stone. It feels cathartic to see all of the history we've experienced still remembered, all the pain and joy we went through honored by Marjorie and Effia's necklace. When she was born, Marjorie's parents sent Akua Marjorie's umbilical cord to bury in the ocean, as she believes that when Marjorie dies, she'll know how to return to Ghana. Akua's visions continue here, illustrating her goal. In my dreams, I kept seeing this castle, but I did not know why. One day I came to these waters and could feel the spirits of our ancestors calling to me. Some were free, and they spoke to me from the sand, but others were trapped deep, deep, deep in the water, so I had to wade out to hear their voices. When they were living, they had not known where they came from, and so dead, they did not know how to get to dry land. I put you in here so that if your spirit ever wandered, you would know where home was. In her own way, the two of them walking on the beach was a ritual to remind Marjorie of how to come home. Marjorie deals with different conflicts within her chapter that mix among each other. Here, some of Yaa Gyasi's authorial intent comes through as Marjorie's own struggle growing up reflects Jesse's own struggle. While she visits Akua every summer, she can still feel herself pulled away, spending too much time away from Ghana to be Ghanaian. She tells as much to Mrs. Pinkston, her teacher, when she asks her to share a poem at the cultural event which is called The Waters We Wade In. In response to this, Mrs. Pinkston tells her, here in this country, it doesn't matter where you came from first to the white people running things. You're here now, and here, black is black is black. This struggle, Marjorie's perceived disconnecting from Ghana, struggles with her struggles to fit in America. At her new high school, there were more black children than Marjorie was used to seeing in Alabama, but it took only a few conversations with them for Marjorie to realize that they were not the same kind of black that she was, that indeed she was the wrong kind. We see other black students ridicule Marjorie for reading and studying and sounding, quote, like a white girl. And this dichotomy reflects Yesie's own internal struggles when she was growing up, while also living in Huntsville, Alabama, just like Marjorie is. She also experienced someone in Ghana one time when she was younger, calling a white man an abroni, which Yaa uses as a history lesson for her, that the young of Ghana, itself an infant country, had been born to a place emptied of its colonizers. To them, to call someone a brony was an innocent act, an interpretation of race as skin color. These two struggles cycle together, creating discontent within Marjorie as she tries to understand herself. We see that Yaa did complete his book, which is now called The Ruin of a Nation Begins in the Homes of Its People, which pulls from a Sante proverb. Marjorie has tried to read the book, but found it difficult to understand. Mrs. Pinkston asks if Marjorie likes the copy of Lord of the Flies that she's reading, which she does, and Mrs. Pinkston asks her if she feels it inside her. With her internal struggles with identity that are hard for Marjorie to conceptualize, she turns to reading, spending 3 years trying to find books that she could feel inside her. Through this work, she meets Graham, a recent immigrant from Germany, and they become friends, introducing a complication for Marjorie next to her internal worries, a crush on Graham. While Marjorie worries about her crush, she asks Yaa how he knew that he loved Esther, and he responds with a joke saying she's too young to think about that and to focus on her studies, and calls her Abronoma. I remember seeing this and getting something like whiplash. Abernoma hasn't been mentioned since Ness's chapter so long ago, and the fact that Yaa calls Marjorie his dove, coincidentally, is so strange. It's even stranger, yet understandable metatextually, that Marjorie doesn't like being called that, which makes her feel small, young, and fragile. Maybe Marjorie inherited some knowledge of Abernoma enough to not feel right to be called that. Marjorie goes on a few dates with Graham that further explore her feelings of disconnection and discontent. He shares poetry with her, but she's too shy to share her own writing. He wants to read the poem that she wrote for the assembly, which she's hesitant about. Marjorie also reveals her fear of fire, which she got when she heard the story of Yaa and Akua's scars. She'd worried that she'd see the firewoman in her dreams too when she was younger, and thought she could see the reflection of the firewoman Mame in any fire that she saw, but in the end she never really dreamed anything, so it just settled into a normal fear of fire. When Akua grows sick, Marjorie makes Akua promise to survive long enough until the next summer when Marjorie could visit. On another date with Graham, he asks her if she'd ever move back to Ghana, which she says she wouldn't. Reiterating her struggle, she doesn't feel like she belongs in Ghana and that the people can smell how different she is. Smell what? Marjorie looked up, trying to capture the right word. Loneliness, maybe, or aloneness, the way I don't fit here or there. My grandmother's the only person who really sees me. After this confession, Graham kisses her. We now see the fear of Akua's passing taking over Marjorie's thoughts. Her insecurities were at least held at bay with the thought of Akua, who understood Marjorie's liminal state, and with the threat of losing her loved one, they pile onto Marjorie so strongly and so abstractly that it's hard to understand them. Marjorie feels panic creeping at her edges. This makes her relationship with Graham struggle as she hadn't seen him since their last kiss. She explains it as stress from the assembly, which is a lie, and the rift between them grows larger as a white girl pulls Graham away, saying that he shouldn't sit with Marjorie, implying you, white person, shouldn't be sitting with black person. She wants Graham to fight for her while also telling him that he can go, both her fear and her love fighting with her. And he does. Graham leaves, and Marjorie sadly accepts it. Like H before, Marjorie surrounds herself in her loneliness as she realizes that Graham, despite being a loner like her, can still belong there, unlike her. Throughout their relationship, the oncoming prom also gave Marjorie worry, but she knew that no one would ask any black students to prom. She had hoped Graham would defy the norm, but in the end he didn't. And after their last interaction, he calls her and apologizes that he couldn't take her to prom. He had wanted to take Marjorie, but his father didn't think it would be proper. The school didn't think it was appropriate. As a last defense, Marjorie had heard him tell the principal that she was, quote, not like other black girls. And somehow, that had been worse. She had already given him up. On top of all of her worries, the structural societal oppression adds another layer of pain for Marjorie. In the end of her chapter, the assembly finally arrives, and inspired by Akua, she writes the poem for the assembly and prepares to read it. Similar to Willie and Akua, Marjorie seems to have a premonition, her stomach hurting, and she prepares for something bad. And she reads her poem. If I knew anything about poetry, I'd try to analyze its meaning, but I don't know shit about poetry, so I'll just read it and appreciate its beauty. I turn the light on. Ooh, that makes a nice shadow. Split the castle open. Find me, find you. We, too, felt sand, wind, air. One felt whip. Whipped once shipped. We, too, black. Me, you. One grew from cocoa soil, birthed from nut, skin uncut, still bleeding. We, too, wade. The water seemed different, but our same. Our same. Sister skin. Who knew? Not me, not you. It's pulling from the story of Effia and her hidden sister Esi, mentioning the Cape Coast Castle, slavery, Ghana, and the ocean. It might also be Marjorie attempting to marry her desperate connections together to find a cohesion within her, the Marjorie who doesn't belong here and the Marjorie who doesn't belong there. How the water may seem different, but is the same. We learn that Marjorie's premonition was Akua's death. The only promise old lady Akua, the crazy woman of Edweso, broke was the last one she made. She died in the middle of a sleep she used to fear. She wanted to be buried on the mountain overlooking the sea. Marjorie and her parents leave for Ghana immediately and attend her funeral. Marjorie wanted to leave her poem in the grave, but they buried her coffin before she could. Marjorie hadn't been able to cry before, but now it all comes out. Marjorie threw herself onto the funeral mound, crying finally, "Mi mami, mi mame, mi mami, mi mame." Her mother came to lift her up off the ground. Later, Ezra told her that it looked like she was going to fly off the cliff, down the mountain, and into the sea. With this final note, the imagery of Marjorie returning to the sea evokes the idea of returning to the coast after her death. At the end of her chapter, Marjorie has not been able to overcome her insecurities and fears, but has at least vocalized them within her poetry and her sadness. It's equally cathartic, seeing Marjorie's outburst of emotion after so much has been built up within her, as learning of Effia's lineage's stories continuing within Marjorie. Both moments are equally cathartic, at least to me. Unlike all of the past chapters within Effia and Esi's lineages equally, this chapter ends at literal and figurative cliffhanger, as we want to know how Marjorie comes out of these events, which is where we finally reach the end of the road. A summary of Marcus's chapter. In 2000, Sonny's son, Marcus Clifton, attends Stanford University, earning a PhD in sociology. At a party, he avoids going into the pool, afraid of water, which stems from his father telling him about slavery. Sonny taught Marcus alternate history lessons throughout his youth, having grown up sharing a mattress in Willie's apartment. Sonny has battled his addiction, regularly going to a methadone clinic to help him. They call each other weekly, and Sonny pushes Marcus to focus on his studies while he also misses his own family. Marcus's research becomes overwhelming as each new thing he learns leads to new anger and despair in the past, making Marcus frustrated with the past and avoiding his research. His friend Deontay invites him to a party where he meets Marjorie, and he feels like he has been found. They begin a strong friendship as she teaches him about Ghana, and he learns that she hasn't returned to Ghana for 14 years since the death of her grandmother. They travel together to Pratt City, where he tries to glean new inspiration for his research, but nothing comes from it. And they decide to travel to Ghana together, and he convinces Marjorie to visit the Cape Coast Castle, which she's never done, as it's the tourist spot now. They take a tour through the upper levels, and then down to the lower levels in the dungeon, where they see the female dungeons. Marcus has a panic attack learning about the history and runs through the doors onto the ocean. A pair of men have a bonfire at the beach at the edge of the water, and the water is full of ships. Marjorie follows him out, and they both stand between fire and water, both overcoming each other's fear. They wade into the waters of the ocean, and Marjorie gives Marcus Effia's necklace to wear, welcoming him home. Marcus's chapter is saddled with not only presenting his story, but also shouldering the responsibility of ending this book. And yes, he accomplishes both well. Marcus's story boils down to an internal struggle with his own research, along with the revelations he gets from meeting Marjorie. We are introduced to Marcus with his fear of the ocean. He was in college for the first time he saw the ocean up close, and it made his stomach turn. All that space, that endless blue, reaching out further than an eye could hold. It terrified him. This, of course, blatantly contrasts Marjorie's fear of fire, and his fear, of course, calls back to other mentions of the ocean. Both of their fears connect to events important to their respective ancestors. Marjorie feels fire, which was Effia's curse, while Marcus fears water, which was how Effia was taken away from the Gold Coast. Sonny had told him that black people didn't like water because of the slave ships that took them here, and the image of the ocean floor littered with the bodies of black men stayed with Marcus. This also mirrors Ma'aku's bad feeling for Kojo's shipbuilding. We learn about Sonny's improvement, showing his decision at the end of his chapter has led him to bettering himself, going to the methadone clinic that Marcus realizes is the only reason Sonny is alive. Sonny's journey has inspired Marcus to live. He learned that his father's mind was a brilliant mind, but it was trapped beneath something. Sonny cried with pride when Marcus was accepted to Stanford, a beautiful marker of how much he's accomplished. Stanford, of course, is the same college that Yaa Gyasi went to. Marcus's connection to his family, missing Willie and Josephine and Sonny, is what inspired part of his research, while also exemplifying why the part 2 cut before H's chapter means so much. He wanted to focus on the convict leasing system that H was a part of, having learned from Willie about his great-grandfather's story. Unlike Marjorie, who could track her family all the way to Effia, granted this was aided by Akua's visions, Marcus can only go as far as H. And his research gets deeper, and the story gets deeper. This book deserves another full-page reading. So yes. How could he talk about great-grandpa H's story without also talking about his grandma Willie and the millions of other black people who had migrated north fleeing Jim Crow? And if he mentioned the Great Migration, he'd have to talk about the cities that took the flock in. He'd have to talk about Harlem. And how could he talk about Harlem without mentioning his father's heroin addiction, the stints in prison, the criminal record? And if he was going to talk about heroin in Harlem in the 60s, wouldn't he also have to talk about a crack everywhere else in the 80s? And if he wrote about crack, he'd eventually be writing too about the war on drugs. And if he started talking about the war on drugs, he'd be talking about how nearly half the black men he grew up with were on their way either into or out of what had become the harshest prison system in the world. And if he talked about why his friends from his hood were doing 5-year bids for possession of marijuana when nearly all the white people he'd gone to college with smoked it openly every day, he'd get so angry that he'd slam the research book on the table of the beautiful but deadly silent Lane reading room of Green Library of Stanford University. And if he slammed the book down, then everyone in the room would stare, and all they could see would be his skin and his anger, and they'd think they knew something about him, and it would be the same something that had justified putting his great-grandpa H in prison, only it would be different too, less obvious than it once was. When Marcus started to think this way, he couldn't get himself to open even one book. The ever-expanding growth of the research and the connections with the family in history seems, to me, to mirror his fear of the ocean, as he describes the research as so overwhelming and vast, just as the ocean is. Marcus wants to search for answers about his past. The idea of visions comes up one last time, as Willie says Marcus sometimes has visions. He'd be with his family in Willie's house during Sunday dinners, a tradition that continues even now, and would feel happy and full. In that room with his family, he would sometimes imagine a different room, a fuller family. He would imagine so hard that at times he thought he could see them. Sometimes in a hut in Africa, a patriarch holding a machete. Sometimes outside in a forest of palm trees, a crowd watching a young woman carrying a bucket on her head. Sometimes in a cramped apartment with too many kids, or a small failing farm, around a burning tree, or in a classroom. He would see these things while his grandmother prayed and sang, and he would want so badly for all these people he made up in his head to be there in that room with him. This part is so powerful, and though he denies having actual visions, Marcus does glimpse the past, as every detail of this can be traced to someone. The patriarch holding a machete and the crowd watching a woman carrying a bucket is about Essie. The cramped apartment is Kojo and his 7 children. The failing farm is Abena and James. The burning tree is Akua. The classroom is Yaw. And this aching feeling inside him, the want and need to have the family within him, transcends over boundaries and decades. The want of Effia and Esi to know each other, living on through Marcus. Marcus remembers a moment in his past when his absent mother Amani had basically kidnapped a younger Marcus, taking him around Harlem. Sonny and Willie had found Marcus and Amani, and they returned him to his family, and remembers that moment vividly. He was still amazed by it, not by the fear he'd felt throughout the day, but by the fullness of love and protection he'd felt later when his family had finally found him. Not the being lost, but the being found. When Marcus meets Marjorie, he feels the same feeling, like she'd found him. As Marjorie shares with Marcus the history of Ghana, us the audience, get this full feeling as the branching lineages of Effia and Esi, who had wanted to know each other, finally meet. When Marjorie finds Marcus, Effia has found Esi. Marjorie tells Marcus she's afraid of fire, and she says that Akua had said her family was born of a great fire, and she says she hasn't been to Ghana since Akua's death 14 years ago. Marjorie's parents have since died, Yaw and Esther, at an indeterminate time, and we see that Marjorie is now wholly alone, but she doesn't act in despair or sadness. She's overcome that, studying African and African American literature, a remnant of her reading a lot. They visit Pratt City in an attempt to reinvigorate Marcus's research, but he doesn't feel anything there despite it being H's home after prison. How could he explain to Marjorie that what he wanted to capture with this project was the feeling of time, of having been part of something that stretched so far back, was so impossibly large that it was easy to forget that she and he and everyone else existed in it, not apart from it, but inside of it. This also recalls Yesi's desire to share and honor the history she researched. To me, his work is an attempt to breach the fear of the vastness he gets from the ocean and possibly where it stems from. He tells Marjorie why he's so afraid of the ocean. It's because all of that space. It's because everywhere I look, I see blue and I have no idea where it begins. When I'm out there, I stay as close as I can to the sand because at least then I know where it ends. The vastness of time and the vastness of space are compared here to carry his message, his fear of being overwhelmed, of being lost. And Marcus believes Marjorie also fears fire for the same reasons. At the end of the chapter, they visit Ghana, passing through Edwesta and Takadori, Yaw and Esther's birthplaces, respectively. Marjorie and Marcus keep being told welcome by different people who recognize Marjorie or knew Akua, or just simply strangers. When they go to the Cape Coast, Marcus wants to visit the castle. Both of them retread the same steps Effia and Esi went through. Marcus even sees women gathering around a very old tree, eating nuts and braiding each other's hairs, which might be a direct reference, if not the exact tree, that Effia rested along with the other Fante wives. The castle is described as dingy and old, contrasting the lavish bright white that Effia and Esi had experienced. They learn about the Fante wives and see the same church where Effia was married. The description evokes the feeling Yesi herself got when she visited the castle, of the hidden underneath dungeons. They are taken to the female dungeons, where Esi was taken through, and they see a sign above a door marked Door of No Return. Marcus begins to have a panic attack, and he barrels out of the dungeons, desperate to not be in the dungeons anymore. At the beach, he sees a mess of boats on the ocean, a parallel moment to Effia and Esi also looking to the ships in the Atlantic, and stands next to the fire at the beach. When Marjorie approaches, he helps her overcome her fear of the fire, providing support. Marcus gives this to Marjorie. She walked to where he stood, where the fire met the water. He took her hand, and they both looked into the abyss of it. The fear that Marcus had felt inside the castle was still there, but he knew it was like the fire, a wild thing that could still be controlled, contained. Marjorie, in turn, runs into the ocean and helps Marcus overcome his fear of the water. When he finally lifted his head up from the sea to cough, then breathe, he looked out at all the water before him, at the vast expanse of time and space. Marjorie gives this to Marcus. We can feel a finality to him, being able to face the vast. Perhaps now he can finish his writing. Perhaps this was Yaa Gyasi's attempt to do the same as Marcus, to capture time and their existence within it. Marcus is in the Gold Coast, where Esi lived before being taken away. She was given the other half of Mame's stone right before she was captured and then lost it. Part of me wants Marcus to have found Esi's stone, perhaps in a museum of artifacts found in the castle, and using Marjorie's half to match the stone and see, wow, how they make a larger shape, a shape with meaning. Perhaps finding the other half of the stone would have tied up the story in a nicely shaped bundle, meaning and understanding. But the realism of this book doesn't allow for that, because history is not nicely bundled. So Marcus does not find Esi's stone, but Marjorie gives him Effia's. And if you can't have one, the other serves the same. Through every struggle and every conflict, every happiness and every love, each character feeds into each other. Effia to Quey to James to Abena to Akua to Yaw to Marjorie. Esi to Ness to Kojo to H to Willie to Sonny to Marcus. All of history has led them here. Marcus, who is the first of his family to leave the United States since Esi's capture, is finally returned to the Gold Coast. Marjorie tells Marcus, welcome home, and in this, spiritually, Effia tells Esi, welcome home. They have finally gone home. Final comments. Oh my god, thank you so much again for letting me talk about this amazing book. I am sorry it's so long, and I don't feel like I really fully encapsulated the emotion in this book, but it's all I could do right now. I'm sorry it's so long, so thank you if you got to this part. The characters and themes bring so much emotion to this book that makes me cry whenever I read it. Every single story connects to each other, and it maintains the complexity of the overarching idea without sacrificing the individual stories. Just the idea of Willie's story or Abena's story or Kojo's story just on their own is so powerful, and then just compared to everything else. Oh my god. This is the final annotated family tree. I only added the births and deaths that we know about, at least the deaths that we know about. I had to do a lot of math for the births and some guesswork too. And this is my simplified family tree with also current dates. It was really fun to decipher when these chapters occurred, and I learned a lot about Ghanaian history as well. Please read this book. It's amazing. The prose doing amazing subtle work throughout, and I'll put links to different places where you can buy the book. Reading books and stories written in different countries and cultures than the one you live in can be so educational and illuminating. Again, it wasn't until I was actually recording this that I realized, yeah, it was Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's The Danger of a Single Story that inspired me to read these books alongside the want to experience something outside of the United States. Yaa Gyasi has written another book, Transcendent Kingdom, about a Ghanaian nurse student dealing with religion within her family, which I've also added to my reading list. Other African stories I found I want to read are The Death of Vivek Oji by Akua Willie, a queer coming of age in Nigeria. Out There Screaming, an anthology of new black horror edited by Jordan Peele. Womb City by Tholotlo Thamasi, a science fiction thriller set in a dystopian Botswana. This is the last video of the set of 3, and I really loved being able to share my love for Please Look After Mom by Kyung Suk Shin, The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy, and finally Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi. It's going to take a long time before I do another book. Most likely it's going to be either 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna, 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, or The Honeys by Ryan Lasala. I'm not going to do a set. It's going to be individual ones. But it's going to take a long time. That's very far in the future. I also have the next Fear Entity Expiration to do before the production cycle starts for my thoughts, ideas, and theories videos for the second season of the Magnus Protocol, which starts late February. So keep an eye out for those new projects as they come out. So, book tour or notebook tour. I have Acrobat because I was like, you have to. The only way to get a Crobat is to befriend a Golbat and take care of it, and that's the only way to evolve. So love, love and family. This crab with the gay gay flag. Crab because of ocean. Gay because of Quey. These goggles that talk about that have like pictures of the ocean. Yeah, because of the ocean. Being a prominent theme. Queer Duat because of ocean and water. And then don't be jelly. Flip, don't be jelly. Being ocean again. I don't have anything for fire, unfortunately. I didn't get any fire types. I don't know why. For Pokemon when I got these stickers. But yes. Anyways, thank you so much again for watching. Please like, subscribe, and comment, and share with your friends. Comment if you read this book before or if you were inspired to read it from me. I really enjoyed talking about this book with you. I want to be true to who I am as a reader and as a writer. And so making these videos is so, so fun. Can't wait to be able to do the next one whenever I can. Don't be afraid to be passionate, and I'll see you later.